A quiet street, a locked door, a light left on inside a house that nobody will ever come home to. These are real people who knew something they were not supposed to, and then, one day, they were just gone. 10 people, 10 secrets. None of them made it through to the other side of what they found. Get out the map, lock your doors, and let's get into it. If you're new here, subscribe. New cases every week. The year is 1826, and upstate New York is a place held together by grudges and whispers. The Erie Canal has just opened. The economy is shifting. Towns like Batavia are growing fast, filling up with tradesmen and lawyers and county officials who are figuring out the new rules of who gets power and how you keep it. And in that world, in that specific, particular world of small-town American ambition in the 1820s, there was no more efficient engine for advancement than a Masonic lodge. The Freemasons were not a fringe organization. They were not a curiosity. In Western New York in 1826, the Masons were woven into the fabric of every institution that mattered. The judges, the sheriffs, the bank directors, the newspaper editors, the men who decided which contracts got signed and which complaints got heard and which debts got forgiven. They had been meeting in private rooms, swearing oaths over candles, exchanging coded handshakes for decades. And the understanding, unspoken but absolute, was that what happened in those rooms stayed in those rooms. William Morgan understood those rooms. He had been inside them. Morgan was in his early 50s, a stonecutter and drifter who had spent his adult life moving his family across the rural Northeast in a sequence of failed ventures and borrowed money that never quite resolved. He drank more than he should have. He owed more than he could repay. He was, by most accounts, in Batavia, New York, the small town where he had finally landed, after years of wandering, not a man anyone would have bet on. He had claimed membership in Masonic lodges in multiple states, and those claims were disputed. Some said he had been properly initiated. Others said he had talked his way in, or lied his way in, or simply walked through a door that someone had forgotten to lock. But he was in, and now he was going to write a book about it. The book was called Illustrations of Masonry. Morgan had found a partner, a local newspaper owner and printer named David Miller, who was struggling to keep his operation solvent and who saw the manuscript as a financial lifeline. Together they had a plan. Print everything. The degree ceremonies, laid out step by step, the secret passwords and recognition signals, the coded handshakes that allowed a Mason traveling through an unfamiliar town to identify himself to another Mason, to claim hospitality, to receive favors from strangers who were bound by oath to provide them. The rituals that tied the most powerful men in Western New York to each other across county lines and court jurisdictions. Print it all. Sell it to a public that had been wondering about these rooms for decades. Here's the critical detail. The moment that plan became known, 3 Masonic lodges across multiple counties began coordinating, not just talking, not just grumbling, coordinating in the specific, purposeful way that organizations coordinate when they have decided that a problem needs to be solved before it gets any bigger. First came the harassment. Miller's print shop was set on fire. Morgan was sued for small debts, the kind of pretextual legal action that in 1826 could result in arrest and brief imprisonment without much judicial scrutiny. Subscribers to Miller's newspaper began canceling their accounts without explanation, one after another, in numbers that made clear the cancellations were organized rather than spontaneous. The pressure was steady, escalating, and unmistakably coordinated across lodges that had no legitimate reason to be talking to each other about a newspaper subscription list. Then came the arrests. On September 11, 1826, Morgan was arrested in Batavia on a charge that barely held together on paper, an allegedly unpaid $2 tavern bill. His publisher paid the debt within hours and secured his release. Morgan walked out of the jailhouse a free man. And then, within the hour, he was arrested again. A different charge, a different county. He was transferred to the jail at Canandaigua, roughly 50 miles east of Batavia, on a charge that was similarly thin, a debt owed to a local merchant, an amount that was, by any reasonable standard, too trivial to justify the distance involved. The Batavia sheriff, a man with documented ties to the Masonic Lodge, was, at the critical moments during all of this, nowhere to be found. That is not speculation or inference. That is documented in the subsequent legal proceedings and commission records. At the exact moments when his presence might have complicated what was being organized, he was absent. This is where it stops being normal. The night of September 11th, moving into the early hours of September 12th, a carriage arrived at the jailhouse in Canandaigua. The exact number of men who came with it is disputed across the historical accounts. Estimates range from 4 to as many as a dozen. What is not disputed is what happened next. The jailer at Canandaigua stepped aside. Whether he was paid, persuaded, threatened, or simply too afraid to object has never been established. What was established, in testimony from multiple witnesses, is that Morgan was walked out of the jail and loaded into the waiting carriage, while the men who should have protected him did nothing. The carriage moved north through the night. It was seen. Multiple witnesses at multiple points along the route reported seeing it, reported hearing a voice that some of them identified as Morgan's, reported watching it pass in the dark and continue toward the Canadian border. It was placed at the village of Lewiston on the Niagara River. It was placed at Fort Niagara itself, where the river narrows before it empties into Lake Ontario and where the current runs fast and cold and dark in September. And then it was placed nowhere at all. Because after Fort Niagara, William Morgan was never seen again. Now this is where the case turns dark, not because of the violence of what happened, but because of the perfect, institutional completeness of what came after. Trials were held between 1827 and 1829. 4 men were eventually convicted in connection with the abduction: Lowton Lawson, Eli Bruce, Colonel Edward Sawyer, and Nicholas Chesebro. The charges were not murder. They were not manslaughter. They were not even kidnapping in any form that carried serious consequences. The men were convicted of the specific offense of forcibly moving William Morgan from one location to another against his will. Their sentences ranged from 1 month to 2 years in county jail. They served their time. They went home. Several of the jurors who sat in those trials were themselves Freemasons. The judge who presided his Masonic affiliations are documented in commission transcripts, though disputed by some historians who have examined the same records and reached different conclusions. The governor of New York, DeWitt Clinton, issued a reward of $1,000 for information leading to Morgan's whereabouts or the recovery of his body. The reward sat unclaimed for years. It was never collected. No body was ever produced. No grave was ever identified. But here's what does not make sense, and it is the detail that refuses to resolve no matter how many times you examine it. $1,000 was an enormous sum in 1826. In a community where Morgan was not well liked, where he owed money to half the town, where he was regarded by many as a drunk and a braggart, and a man who had no business pretending to the secrets he claimed to hold in that community, with that much money on the table, no one spoke. Not one person who had seen the carriage at Fort Niagara came forward to claim the reward. The silence was not the silence of ignorance. It was the silence of people who knew exactly what had happened and had decided, collectively, that they would never say. In 1848, a man named Henry L. Valance made a deathbed confession. He claimed to have been one of Morgan's abductors. He claimed that he and 2 other men had rowed Morgan out onto the Niagara River in the dark, that they had tied weights to his body, and that they had thrown him over the side of the boat and held him under until the current took him. This account was later published by the Reverend Charles Finney in an 1869 book. It has never been independently verified. Masonic historians have disputed it consistently. A competing tradition holds that Morgan was paid a substantial sum, $500, in some accounts, to disappear permanently into Canada, and that he was spotted alive in Ontario in the years following his disappearance. That account is also unverified. The truth is that no verified account of Morgan's fate has ever been produced, in any court, by any authority, in the nearly 200 years since the carriage left Canandaigua in the dark. Morgan's book was published anyway. Miller completed the manuscript from Morgan's notes and released it into a public already electrified by the story of what had been done to its author. It became a bestseller. The secrets it revealed, the rituals, the oaths, the recognition signals, the structure of the degree ceremonies poured into public circulation. Masonic membership in the United States fell by roughly half over the following decade. No new lodges were chartered for years. The political fury over Morgan's disappearance gave birth to the Anti-Masonic Party, America's first organized third political party, which ran a presidential candidate in 1832 and won the governorship of several states. His disappearance proved the book's point more completely than the book itself ever could have. Think about the chain of events that had to be constructed to get to that night on the Niagara River. Someone decided that a fire at a print shop was the appropriate first response to a forthcoming book. When the fire failed, someone decided that a series of fabricated legal charges was the appropriate second response. When those charges failed to hold, someone decided that an abduction from a county jailhouse with a waiting carriage and a multi-county coordination of law enforcement complicity was the appropriate third response. Each escalation required more people, more coordination, more institutional reach. The plan kept having to be revised upward because the previous version had not been enough. And at every stage, the men who were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of thing from happening were either absent, complicit, or standing aside with their hands in their pockets. Morgan's wife Lucinda waited. She had no body to bury and no legal determination of death to act upon. She eventually remarried under a specific provision of the emerging Mormon faith that allowed a widow to wed while her husband remained technically and legally missing, not confirmed dead, simply gone. The American legal system never formally determined what had happened to William Morgan. There was no death certificate. There was no estate settlement based on confirmed death. He was entered into the record as a man who had been abducted, and then the record had nothing more to say about him. The monument in Batavia, which still stands, does not use the word allegedly. It does not say reportedly or according to some accounts. It reads that William Morgan was murdered for revealing the secrets of their order. The stone takes the position that the courts would not. No body, no grave, no answer, just a carriage disappearing into the dark at the edge of a river, and a town full of people who knew what had happened and carried that knowledge with them for the rest of their lives without ever giving it to anyone. Morgan vanished in a country that was barely 50 years old. The next case happened in a country that considered itself the most powerful on earth, and the man who disappeared was working for it. Fort Detrick, Maryland, 1953. Picture the place. A sprawling military installation set back from the road in the low rolling hills of Frederick County, surrounded by chain-link fencing and security checkpoints, and the particular hush that settles over a facility where the work being done inside cannot be discussed outside. The Cold War is not a metaphor at this point. It is a daily, operational reality. The Soviet Union has tested its first hydrogen bomb. The Korean War has just ended in an armistice that satisfied no one. And in the corridors of the American national security apparatus, the belief that the next war would be won or lost not on conventional battlefields but in laboratories in the development of chemical agents, biological weapons, psychological techniques that could break a human mind as efficiently as a bullet breaks a body. That belief is driving programs that do not appear in any public budget and are not subject to any public oversight. Frank Olsen worked inside those programs. He was 43 years old in the autumn of 1953. He had a wife named Alice, 3 children, Eric, Lisa, and Nils, a house in the Maryland suburbs, a lawn he mowed on weekends, a habit of performing magic tricks for the neighborhood kids that his son would still be describing 60 years later, with the kind of warmth that never quite leaves a man when he talks about his father. He was a bacteriologist by training, an army contractor by employment, a man whose official title gave no indication of what he actually did. He worked in the Special Operations Division at Fort Detrick, which was a CIA research unit embedded inside a military installation, which was itself the kind of institutional arrangement that exists specifically to make accountability difficult to trace. What Frank Olsen actually did was this. He helped develop, test, and evaluate biological and chemical agents for potential use by the United States government in wartime and in covert operations. He traveled to Europe, to West Germany, to Norway, to the United Kingdom on trips that were not academic conferences and were not diplomatic missions. He was present at black sites, operated by the CIA, where captured individuals believed to have intelligence value were subjected to what the agency's own internal documents would later describe as experimental interrogation, combinations of drugs, hypnosis, sustained psychological pressure administered over days and weeks. Techniques designed not merely to extract information, but to fundamentally alter the relationship between a person and their own will. His son Eric, who spent decades reconstructing what his father had witnessed and done, would say publicly that Frank Olsen had been present at interrogations where people had been, in his words, interrogated to death. He had been briefed on Operation Paperclip, the classified program that brought Nazi scientists, men who had conducted experiments on concentration camp prisoners, into American service after the war. He had personally interviewed Walter Schreiber, a German military physician who had overseen human experimentation at Dachau and who was subsequently relocated to the United States under Paperclip's umbrella. He had seen things, in other words, that the official version of post-war America, the version that prosecuted Nazi war criminals at Nuremberg while simultaneously recruiting their colleagues for domestic research programs, could not afford to have spoken aloud. By the spring of 1953, Olsen had stepped down from his position as chief of the Special Operations Division. He cited the pressures of the job. His supervisor, Lieutenant Colonel Vincent Rouvette, noted the change. Colleagues noticed it too. Something was different about Frank Olsen in the months before the retreat at Deep Creek Lake. A guardedness, a weight, a quality of a man who was carrying something he had not yet decided what to do with. Then came November 18, 1953. Olsen and roughly a dozen colleagues gathered at a remote cabin on Deep Creek Lake in the mountains of rural Maryland. The retreat was described as informal, a chance for the men of the technical services staff to decompress, to talk shop away from the institutional environment of Fort Detrick and Langley. There was dinner, there was conversation, and after dinner, someone produced a bottle of Cointreau, the orange liqueur, and glasses were poured and passed around. 20 minutes after drinking, several of the men began to feel strange. Sidney Gottlieb, the CIA chemist who ran MKUltra, the agency's classified program investigating the use of LSD and other substances as tools of psychological manipulation and interrogation, had spiked the liqueur. He had added LSD to the bottle before it was opened. No one in the room had been told. No one had consented. Gottlieb would later testify that he informed the men approximately 20 minutes after they drank, after the drug was already in their systems and beginning to take effect as part of what he characterized as a study of the substance's impact on unwitting subjects. Most of the men recovered over the hours that followed. They experienced confusion, disorientation, the particular vertigo of a reality that has become unreliable, and then they came back to themselves. The retreat continued. They returned to their ordinary lives. Frank Olsen did not come back to himself. He returned to Maryland the following day, described by Lieutenant Colonel Ruett as a changed man, withdrawn, paranoid in a way that was qualitatively different from ordinary anxiety, unable to concentrate. He told Alice that something was terribly wrong. He told colleagues that he had made a terrible mistake, a phrase that he repeated in the days that followed, without ever specifying what the mistake had been, or whether he was referring to something he had done, something he had witnessed, something he had agreed to that he now could not agree to anymore. He expressed, clearly and directly, to multiple people in his life, that he wanted to leave the CIA. He wanted out. He wanted to be done with it. This is where it stops being normal, because the response to a man in profound psychological distress who was expressing a desire to leave a classified government program was not to send him to his own doctor. It was not to refer him to an independent psychiatrist. It was not to give him time or space or any form of care that existed outside the institutional structure he was trying to leave. His supervisor arranged for him to travel to New York City to see a man named Harold Abramson. Abramson held a medical degree and was affiliated with a hospital, but his primary relationship to the CIA was not as an independent clinician. It was as a researcher who had himself worked with Olsen on studies related to aerosolization of biological and chemical agents. He was, in precise terms, already inside the circle of what Frank Olsen knew. He was not a neutral party. He was not outside the system. He was the system, wearing a white coat and an office address on the Upper East Side. CIA chemist Robert Lashbrook, Sidney Gottlieb's deputy, one of the men who had been present at Deep Creek Lake when the Cointreau was poured, accompanied Olsen to New York. They arrived together. They checked into room 1018A at the Hotel Statler on 7th Avenue in Midtown Manhattan. Olsen saw Abramson across multiple appointments over several days. By the accounts of everyone who observed him during this period, he was not improving. He was deteriorating. He was frightened. He was not sleeping. He told Rouet by phone that he felt he was in a confusion and did not know what to do. He was a man who had wanted to leave, who had been placed instead in the custody of the institution he wanted to leave, in a hotel room in a city he did not choose, accompanied by a man whose loyalty was not to him. On the night of November 27th, moving into the early hours of November 28th, 1953, Thanksgiving weekend, the hotels in Midtown Manhattan, quiet and half empty, Frank Olsen went through the window of the 13th floor. He was wearing his underwear and an undershirt. He hit the canopy above the hotel entrance, bounced, and struck the sidewalk. The night manager, Armand Pastor, reached him first. Olsen was alive. He was trying to speak. He died before medical help arrived. Now this is where the case turns dark, and it begins with the window. A window broken outward by a body falling through it carries specific and predictable physical evidence. The glass goes outward. The frame shows pressure from the interior. The curtains and blinds, if drawn, are pushed through with the body or torn away. What photographs from the scene suggested, and what would become a central question in every subsequent investigation, was that the window had not been broken outward in the way a spontaneous fall or a leap would produce. The glass pattern was inconsistent. Some investigators and forensic analysts who examined the photographs in later years concluded that the window had been opened or cleared before impact, not shattered through. That is a significant distinction. It is the distinction between a man who ran across a dark room and threw himself through glass, and a man who was placed against a window that had already been prepared. The hotel's night manager, Armand Pastor, gave a statement that has been quoted in every serious examination of this case in the decades since, because it has never been satisfactorily answered. He said that in all his years working in the hotel business, he had never once encountered a situation where a person got up in the middle of the night, crossed a completely dark room in his underwear, navigated around 2 beds, and dove through a closed window with the shade and the curtains fully drawn. He said it as a man who had seen a great deal in his profession and found this specific sequence of events to be unlike anything in his experience. He was not a forensic expert. He was a man who ran a hotel and understood how rooms worked and how people moved through them, and what he was describing was a physical scenario that did not add up. Robert Lashbrook was in the room. He was in the other bed, by his own account, asleep or nearly asleep, when Olsen went through the window. He did not go to the window. He did not call the front desk immediately. He did not call for help. He made a phone call, a call that was logged manually by the hotel's overnight operator, who noted the time and who noted what she heard. Lashbrook said, "He's gone." The voice on the other end of the line said, "Well, that's too bad." And then the call ended. The identity of the person on the other end of that call has never been officially established. The family was not allowed to view the body. They were told it was too badly damaged, too disfigured by the fall and the impact for viewing. This was false. A forensic pathologist who examined the exhumed remains 4 decades later would find the body in far better condition than the family had been led to believe was possible. More importantly, he would find something that the original 1953 autopsy report had not mentioned: a hematoma on the left temple, a bruise consistent with a significant blow to the head, a wound that would have been produced by something striking Frank Olsen before he fell. The original medical examiner had examined the body, had noted injuries consistent with the fall, had not noted the hematoma. The family was told there was nothing to see, and they buried their father and husband without knowing that the report they were never given was incomplete. The death was ruled a suicide in 1953. The CIA conducted an internal investigation. 5 CIA personnel were involved in that process. They paid Harold Abramson, the same man who had been Olsen's designated treatment provider, The same man who was already inside the classified network's substantial sums to provide a psychological assessment of Olsen's state of mind in the weeks before his death. No independent forensic review was commissioned. A Catholic priest who arrived at the scene to administer last rites was quietly turned away. The case was closed. It stayed closed for 22 years. In 1975, the Rockefeller Commission, convened to investigate illegal domestic activities by the CIA, published a report that contained, on page 37, a single paragraph describing an unnamed Army scientist who had been administered LSD without his consent as part of an experimental program, and who had subsequently died. The Commission noted that this conduct was clearly illegal. It provided no name. It provided no follow-up. Eric Olsen, by then a grown man with a career and a family of his own, read that paragraph and recognized his father. Within 10 days, the family was in the Oval Office. President Gerald Ford apologized personally. The government confirmed that Frank Olsen was the unnamed scientist. A financial settlement was negotiated and accepted, and Eric Olsen, who had been 9 years old when his father went out that window, began the investigation that would define the rest of his life. In 1994, after years of legal effort, Eric had his father's body exhumed from its grave in Maryland. A forensic pathologist named James Stars led the examination. He found the hematoma. He found it clearly, documented it thoroughly, and stated for the record that the wound was consistent with a blow to the head administered before the fall, and that the omission of this finding from the original 1953 autopsy report was, in his professional assessment, not an accident. The New York District Attorney, moved by the new forensic evidence, reclassified the death from suicide to circumstances unknown. The case was formally reopened. Subpoenas were considered. Witnesses were identified. No charges were ever filed. The case was reopened, and then, in the way of things, it was not closed so much as allowed to go quiet. The wheels turned, and then stopped turning, and the silence that settled over the case was the specific silence of an investigation that had run into walls that no one with the authority to remove them had chosen to remove. In 2002, Eric Olsen held a press conference. He stated his conclusion plainly and on the record. His father had been murdered, not accidentally killed, not pushed over the edge of sanity by a drug administered without consent, deliberately killed by or at the direction of the CIA, because Frank Olsen had decided in the autumn of 1953 that he could not continue to be part of what he had been part of, and because the things he knew, if spoken aloud, would have been catastrophic for programs that the American government was not prepared to acknowledge. What specifically he was planning to say, and to whom he was planning to say it, that remains, in every official record, unknown. In 2012, Eric Olsen went back to the Hotel Statler. He stood on the sidewalk outside the building, on the exact stretch of pavement where his father had landed at 2 a.m. on a Thursday in 1953. He stood there for a while. He has never stopped asking the question. The CIA has never answered it. Olsen fell from a window in Manhattan. The next case involves a man who was found locked inside a bag padlocked from the outside, and no one has ever been able to explain how he got in there. London, August 2010. The city is moving at the particular slow pace of a warm British summer, the kind of heat that feels borrowed, that Londoners treat with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion, knowing it will not last. The World Cup has just finished in South Africa. The coalition government is 2 months old, and on a quiet residential street in Pimlico, in the kind of neighborhood where the white stucco terraces stand in clean Georgian rows, and the streets are narrow enough that neighbors could theoretically reach across and touch each other's windowsills, a top-floor flat has been dark for over a week. Nobody on the street had noticed. That is the first thing worth holding on to. A man had been dead in that flat for approximately 7 days before anyone came to check on him. Not his neighbors, who either did not know him well enough to notice or noticed and did not act. Not his landlord, because the flat was not a private rental. It was staff accommodation provided by MI6, the British Secret Intelligence Service, for officers and analysts working at the agency's headquarters on the south bank of the Thames, just a few miles away. Not his family, who were in Wales and who were used to the long silences that came with having a son or a brother who worked in intelligence and could not always say where he was or what he was doing. The flat at 36 Alderney Street had been dark for 7 days, and the city had simply continued around it, the way cities do, without pausing to ask why. On August 23, 2010, colleagues at MI6 requested a welfare check. This was 6 days after the estimated date of death, a date that would itself prove impossible to establish with precision, because by the time police entered the flat that afternoon, the body had been there long enough that the forensic window for determining an exact time of death had already closed. Officers gained entry. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere in the flat. The door had not been forced. The windows had not been broken. The lock had not been tampered with. The flat itself appeared, to the first officers who walked through it, entirely undisturbed, the kind of stillness that is different from simply being empty, the kind that comes from a space that has been arranged carefully and left. They moved through the main room. They moved through the bedroom. And then they moved into the ensuite bathroom off the main bedroom, and they found what they had come to find. In the bathtub, sitting upright on the dry porcelain, there was a red North Face sports bag, a standard duffel design, the kind sold in outdoor equipment shops across the country. It was sitting in the bathtub as if it had been placed there deliberately and with care. It was padlocked. The padlock, a combination lock, threaded through the zipper tabs at the top of the bag, was on the outside. And inside the bag, curled into himself in the particular way a body folds when it has been placed rather than fallen, naked, in an advanced state of decomposition that forensic pathologists would later estimate was consistent with approximately 7 days since death, was a 31-year-old mathematician and cryptanalyst from the island of Anglesey in Wales. His name was Gareth Williams. To understand what Gareth Williams was doing in that flat, and why what happened to him has never been satisfactorily explained, you have to understand what he was, not who he appeared to be from the outside, which was a quiet, slightly reserved young man who cycled to work and kept to himself, and was, by all accounts, more comfortable in the Welsh countryside than in the competitive social environment of London, but what he actually was, professionally and intellectually, which was something considerably rarer. Williams had shown a gift for mathematics so pronounced and so early that the normal educational timeline had simply been unable to contain it. He enrolled at Bangor University on a part-time basis while he was still completing his secondary education. He had joined GCHQ, the government communications headquarters in Cheltenham, the United Kingdom's Signals Intelligence Agency, as an analyst while he was still in his early 20s. By the time he was seconded to MI6 in the spring of 2009, he had established himself as one of the most talented cryptanalysts of his generation. A man who could look at patterns in data that others could not see, who could find the signal in noise that defeated everyone else who tried. He was the kind of asset that intelligence agencies spend decades hoping to develop and almost never do. 2 senior British police sources, speaking to journalists in the years after his death, speaking carefully, without attribution, in the way that people speak when they know things they are not authorized to say, confirmed that Williams's work in the period leading up to his death included tracking the money laundering networks used by Moscow-based organized crime cells operating in Western Europe, that this work was conducted in conjunction with analysts at the American NSA, that it was, in the language of the intelligence community, live operational work, not historical analysis, not theoretical modeling, but the active pursuit of financial trails that connected criminal organizations to the people and institutions that protected them. MI6 has never officially confirmed or denied any of this. In the weeks before his death, Williams had been in Las Vegas. He had attended the DEFCON and Black Hat cybersecurity conferences in late July and early August, the 2 most significant gatherings in the world of offensive and defensive digital security, attended by intelligence professionals, academic researchers, criminal hackers, and everyone in between. He had returned to London shortly before the estimated date of his death. He had told colleagues he was looking forward to returning to GCHQ in Cheltenham in September. He had told friends he was tired of London, tired of what he once called, in a phrase that people who knew him remembered precisely, the flash car competitions. He wanted to go back to Wales. He wanted to go home. He never made it. Here's the critical detail, and it is the one that every subsequent investigation has been unable to explain away regardless of the conclusion it reached. The padlock was on the outside of the bag. A forensic expert was commissioned specifically to determine whether it was physically possible for a person to enter a bag of this type and secure the combination lock from the inside. The expert conducted tests. The conclusion was that it was, under normal circumstances, with a person of average flexibility and coordination, practically impossible. The zipper could be drawn closed from inside with considerable effort and contortion that was achievable, though uncomfortable. But the padlock, threaded through the zipper tabs and requiring a person to align the shackle and set the combination while their arms were folded inside a bag that was simultaneously being closed around them, that was a different matter, entirely. The expert found no reliable method by which a person could accomplish this. The physical evidence of such an attempt, stress marks on the zipper, scuff marks on the bag's interior, biological material transferred from struggling hands to the lock mechanism, was not present. The bag was clean. The lock was set. Someone had put Gareth Williams in that bag and locked it from the outside. And yet the flat showed no signs of a struggle. No furniture displaced, no marks on the walls or floor, no biological material from any other person on any surface. The forensic examination found traces of at least 2 unidentified DNA profiles on the exterior of the bag itself, fragments, partial profiles, not enough to run against any database with any confidence, and then nothing, no fingerprints, not on the bag, not on the lock, not on the taps, the door handles, the light switches. The flat was immaculate in the specific way that immaculate crime scenes are immaculate not because nothing had happened, but because someone had been very careful about what they left behind. Williams's family, in statements made in the years following his death, alleged that crucial DNA evidence had been interfered with before the investigation was fully established, and that fingerprints known to have been present at the scene had been removed or degraded. These allegations have never been proven. They have also never been satisfactorily addressed by any official body. Now this is where the case turns dark, and the darkness here is not just in what happened to Gareth Williams. It is in how the institution that employed him responded to his death. MI6 waited 16 days after Williams stopped responding before alerting police. 16 days. This is not a matter of dispute or interpretation. It is a documented fact confirmed in the subsequent inquest. A man with an active security clearance, on secondment from one intelligence agency to another, with regular professional check-in obligations, with colleagues who saw him at work and would notice his absence, missed over 2 weeks of contact before the organization that was responsible for his welfare picked up a phone and called anyone. The coroner who presided over the inquest addressed this directly and without diplomatic softening. She stated that the 16-day delay had likely had a significant bearing on the investigation's fundamental failures, that the decomposition of the body, the degradation of biological evidence, the impossibility of establishing a precise time of death, all of it flowed directly from those 16 days of institutional silence. She described the delay as deeply troubling. She stopped short of saying what it implied. When the Metropolitan Police began their investigation in earnest, they encountered MI6 in a mode that had no precedent in the agency's relationship with domestic law enforcement. The agency declined to provide information about Williams's current operational caseload. It declined to identify his active contacts. It declined to describe the specific nature of the work he had been conducting in the weeks before his death. Officers who worked the investigation described the experience of requesting information from MI6 as being met not with bureaucratic delay, but with a more fundamental refusal, a systematic withholding that the coroner would later describe, with careful legal precision, as falling well short of what a responsible authority in MI6's position should have provided. But here's what does not make sense, and this is the layer of the case that the competing official verdicts cannot resolve between them. The flat contained something else. In Gareth Williams's wardrobe, investigators found a collection of high-end women's clothing, designer pieces. The total estimated value was approximately £25,000. The clothing was not hidden. It was stored as clothing is stored, folded, hung, arranged. The discovery was reported widely in the press, with a clear implication that the details of Williams's private life were relevant to understanding his death. The coroner addressed this directly and without sensationalism. She found no evidence that Williams's personal life had any bearing whatsoever on the manner of his death. She said this plainly and on the record. The clothing was a fact about a person's private life. It was not an explanation. The inquest concluded in 2012. The coroner's verdict: death was unnatural and likely criminally mediated. She stated that she was satisfied, on the balance of probabilities, that another person had placed Williams in the bag and locked it. She could not reach a formal verdict of unlawful killing because the standard of proof required for that determination, the criminal standard, beyond reasonable doubt, could not be met with the evidence available. But criminally mediated stood another person, another set of hands. That was the official conclusion of the official inquest. The Metropolitan Police conducted a further reinvestigation through 2013, and they arrived at a different answer. After what they described as extensive work and unprecedented access to MI6 personnel, they announced that the most probable scenario was that Williams had died accidentally, alone in the flat, having locked himself inside the bag. This conclusion that a trained, healthy 31-year-old man with no known history of risky or self-harmful behavior had, for reasons that were never specified, stripped naked, folded himself into a sports bag, drawn the zipper closed from inside, set a combination padlock from within, and died in this position, without leaving any physical trace of the effort required, was challenged immediately and consistently by independent forensic experts. Not one of them, in any controlled replication attempt conducted since, has successfully locked the specific type of bag from the inside, using the specific type of lock that was found on Williams's bag. The coroner's verdict and the Metropolitan Police's verdict exist simultaneously. They are both on the official record. They directly contradict each other. Gareth Williams is the only person in modern British legal history for whom an official inquest has concluded he was probably murdered, while the official police investigation simultaneously concludes he probably was not. Neither verdict has been withdrawn. Neither has been superseded. They sit in the archive together, two irreconcilable official truths about a man who was 31 years old and wanted to go home to Wales and was found in a bag in a bathtub instead. In 2015, a former KGB officer named Boris Karpichkov, who had defected to the United Kingdom, gave a series of interviews in which he stated that sources within Russian intelligence had told him the SVR, Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, the successor to the KGB's Foreign Operations Directorate, had been responsible for Williams's death. He said the killing was connected to Williams's work tracing money laundering networks used by Moscow-linked organized crime. This claim is unverified. It has not been confirmed by any official investigation. It has also never been formally dismissed by any official investigation. The two unidentified DNA profiles on the bag have never been matched to any known individual. The 16 days have never been explained. The flat that looked staged has never been accounted for. The man who wanted to go back to the countryside never did. Subscribe if you want to go deeper on cases like this. There are more coming every week. Williams was found in a bag in London. In Argentina, the next man was found on his bathroom floor the night before he was supposed to testify in front of Congress. Buenos Aires, January 2015. The city is deep into its southern hemisphere summer, the kind of heat that radiates up from the Rio de la Plata waterfront and sits in the streets well past midnight. Puerto Madero is the newest and most expensive district in Buenos Aires, a development built on reclaimed docklands, all glass towers and waterfront restaurants, and the particular atmosphere of a place that has been designed from the ground up to signal money and stability. It is the kind of neighborhood where powerful people live when they want to be visible about being powerful. It is also, in January of 2015, the neighborhood where Argentina's most prominent federal prosecutor is spending his last night alive. Alberto Nisman was 51 years old. He was heavyset, intense, a man who communicated a sense of barely contained urgency, even in casual settings, a quality that people who worked with him described as the natural consequence of spending a decade in proximity to a crime that had killed 85 people and had never, in the 20 years since it happened, been fully and formally resolved. He had been appointed special prosecutor for the Amia bombing investigation in September 2004. The bombing itself had occurred on July 18, 1994. A car bomb detonated in the early morning outside the headquarters of the Asociación Mutual Israelita Argentina, the Jewish community center in Buenos Aires, collapsing the building and killing 85 people and wounding more than 300. It was the single deadliest terrorist attack in the history of Argentina. It had destroyed families, destroyed a building, and destroyed, in the decade that followed, the careers of multiple investigators and judges who had tried to bring it to resolution and failed. Nisman had not failed. Or rather, he had gone further than anyone before him. By 2006, he had formally accused the government of Iran of having directed the attack and Hezbollah of having carried it out. He had identified the man he believed drove the bomb-laden car. He had traced the operational chain from Tehran to Buenos Aires through a network of Iranian intelligence officers and their local contacts. He had secured Interpol Red Notice's international arrest warrants against 6 Iranian officials, including a former Iranian president and a former foreign minister. He had built, over years of painstaking and dangerous work, what he believed was a prosecutable case. And then Argentina's government began moving in a different direction. In January 2013, President Cristina Fernández de Kirchner's government signed a memorandum of understanding with Iran. It was presented publicly as a diplomatic achievement, a bilateral agreement that would, the government said, allow for joint investigation of the Amia bombing through a mixed commission of Argentine and Iranian jurists. It was framed as a step toward accountability. It was framed as cooperation. Nisman read it as the opposite. He spent the better part of 2 years constructing his argument. He assembled wiretap recordings. He gathered intercepted communications. He built a timeline showing not a government seeking justice, but a government negotiating its way out of the obligation to seek justice, trading the prosecution of Iranian officials for improved trade relations, for oil, for the economic benefits that came with normalized diplomatic ties to Tehran. He concluded and documented in extraordinary detail across 289 pages that President Fernández de Kirchner and her foreign minister had personally directed a scheme to shield the Iranian suspects from prosecution, that the memorandum was not a path to accountability, but a mechanism for avoiding it, that 85 dead Argentines were being used as a bargaining chip in a trade negotiation. He filed his formal criminal complaint on January 13, 2015. He was scheduled to present his evidence and his findings to a congressional committee on January 19. 6 days separated the filing of the complaint and the scheduled testimony. He did not survive those 6 days. Here's the critical detail. On the night of January 18th, Nisman's mother, Sarah Garfunkel, arrived at the apartment building where her son lived, the Torre La Park Tower in Puerto Madero, a glass high-rise on the waterfront, and could not reach him by phone or by buzzing his apartment. She contacted his personal assistant. The personal assistant contacted a locksmith. It was after 3 in the morning when the locksmith arrived and began working on the door. The apartment had 2 entrances, the main door and a service door. The service door was locked from the inside, a detail that would become central to every subsequent argument about what had happened. The locksmith opened it. The group entered. They found Alberto Nisman in his bathroom, lying on the floor. There was a single gunshot wound to his right temple. A Bursa Thunder .22 pistol was on the floor beside him. There was blood. There was no note. The pistol was not his. He did not own a gun. He had borrowed it, days earlier, from his personal computer technician and aide, a man named Diego Lagomarsino, who would later tell investigators that Nisman had asked him for a weapon because he was afraid for his life and wanted protection during the period leading up to his congressional testimony. Lagomarsino gave him the gun. Nisman was found dead with it beside him. The initial official ruling was delivered with a speed that multiple investigators, the Nisman family, and several subsequent courts found troubling. Suicide, the government announced. The president herself issued a public statement in the hours following the discovery of the body, before any forensic examination had been completed, confirming the suicide ruling and offering condolences. Within 4 days, Fernández de Kirchner reversed herself publicly and stated that her initial assessment had been wrong, that Nisman had been murdered. She did not, in making this reversal, acknowledge that her initial statement had been premature. She also, in the same public communication, accused the former director of Argentina's Domestic Intelligence Service of having orchestrated the killing in order to destabilize her government, an accusation that raised the immediate question of how a killing orchestrated to destabilize her government had initially been ruled a suicide by her government within hours of the body being found. This is where it stops being normal, because the physical evidence, examined without regard for any political framing, told a story that neither suicide nor the president's revised narrative fully accommodated. There was no gunpowder residue on Alberto Nisman's hands. None. A person who fires a pistol at close range, close enough to produce a contact or near-contact wound to their own temple, will have gunshot residue on their hands. This is not a subtle forensic point. It is one of the most basic and reliable indicators in the analysis of suspected self-inflicted gunshot wounds. The absence of residue was documented in the initial forensic examination. It was not explained by those who advocated for the suicide ruling. It was noted and set aside. His body showed additional injuries that had no natural explanation within a single gunshot scenario. Bruising to his nose, trauma to his hip and ankle, marks on his body that were inconsistent with a man who had simply walked into his bathroom, raised a gun to his head, and fired. They were consistent with a man who had been in physical contact with other people, with a struggle, or with being held, or with being moved. In 2017, a forensic team assembled by Argentina's border police, an agency independent from the federal police unit that had conducted the initial investigation, produced a report that went significantly further than any previous analysis. The team concluded that Nisman had been beaten by at least 2 attackers, that he had been administered ketamine, a powerful dissociative anesthetic capable of rendering a person incapable of resistance within minutes of administration, that while he was incapacitated from the drug and the beating, he had been held from behind, positioned with his back to another person, his body supported under the arms and shot at close range to his right temple. That the entire scene had then been arranged to present the appearance of a self-inflicted wound, with the pistol placed beside the body and the service door locked from inside using a mechanism that could be engaged without a key. A federal judge had already reached a similar conclusion before the border police report was released. In 2016, federal judge Sandra Arroyo Salgado, who was, in a fact that the Argentine press noted with considerable attention, Alberto Nisman's former wife and the mother of his 2 daughters, concluded in a formal judicial finding that the gunshot wound could not have been self-inflicted and that the death was a homicide. An Argentine federal appeals court confirmed this finding in 2018, describing the death as a homicide that was a direct consequence of his accusations against the president. Now this is where the case turns dark, because the confirmation of murder raised the question that has still not been answered, and may never be answered, with any official finality. Who ordered it? But here's what does not make sense, and it is the detail that sits in the record without explanation. In the weeks before his death, Nisman had told multiple colleagues and associates that he was afraid. He had specifically said, to more than one person, that he believed he might be killed before he could testify. His police security detail, the protective assignment that accompanied him as a function of his role as a prosecutor, handling matters of extreme political sensitivity, had been reduced in the period leading up to his death. The reduction was authorized somewhere in the chain of government responsibility. By whom, on whose instructions, and for what stated reason has never been fully established in any proceeding. His daughter, Ayara, who was in her teens at the time of his death, spoke to him by phone on the evening of January 18th. She testified later that he had sounded calm, organized, that he had spoken about his congressional testimony the following morning in the tone of a man who was prepared and was looking forward to being heard. She said there was nothing in his voice or his words that suggested a man contemplating his own death. He was not saying goodbye. He was preparing to go to work. In the trash can in his apartment, investigators found a document that Nisman had apparently drafted and printed and then discarded, or placed there, or had taken from him and placed there after his death. It was a draft arrest warrant for President Cristina Fernández de Kirchner. It was signed, It was complete. It was ready to file. It was found in a trash can in the apartment of the man who had drafted it, after that man was dead, on the night before he was scheduled to present his evidence to Congress. The former spy chief, Horacio Stiuso, the man who had been one of Nisman's closest collaborators in the construction of his case, the man who possessed intimate knowledge of the wiretaps and the intercepts and the financial trails that Nisman had assembled, was summoned to give testimony in the weeks following the death. His summons was issued publicly, and Stiuso, upon the public announcement that he had been called to testify, disappeared. Not permanently, he resurfaced some months later, but he was unreachable at the precise moment when his testimony would have been most consequential. When he eventually reappeared, he did not provide meaningful public testimony. 4 members of Nisman's security detail were charged with dereliction of duty. The broader investigation into who ordered the killing has continued to move through the Argentine judicial system for a decade. In 2025, on the 10th anniversary of Nisman's death, Argentina's Public Prosecutor's Office released a 56-page report reaffirming the finding of homicide and providing additional documentation of the chain of events leading to his death. As of early 2026, a trial date in the case against those accused of ordering and carrying out the killing has still not been set. His testimony was never delivered. The warrant in the trash was never filed. The Congressional Committee met on January 19, 2015, without the man who had called it into session. The men and women named in his 289-page complaint continued in their positions. The 85 people killed in the EMEA bombing in 1994 are still, in the only sense that matters legally, unavenged. Nisman died the night before he was supposed to speak. In the next case, the journalist was killed 2 days after she went on live television to say she was afraid. The Turkey-Syria border, October 2014. The siege of Kobani has been grinding for weeks. The Kurdish city of Kobani sits just across the border inside northern Syria, and from the Turkish side, from the low hills above the town of Surus in Sanliurfa province, you can see it burning. Not metaphorically, literally burning. Columns of black smoke rising in the daylight hours, and the orange glow of artillery and airstrikes visible against the horizon after dark, close enough that the concussions reach you across the open ground. The Islamic State has surrounded the city. Kurdish fighters are holding, but only barely. The international press has descended on this stretch of the Turkish border in numbers, photographers and television correspondents, and print journalists setting up on rooftops and at border fence lines, trying to document a battle that the world is only beginning to understand the significance of. Serena Shim was already there. She had been there before most of them. She was 29 years old, Lebanese-American, born in Michigan to parents who had immigrated from Lebanon and raised their family in the Dearborn area, one of the largest and most established Arab-American communities in the United States. Her family called her Sassy, a nickname that captured something real about her, by the accounts of everyone who knew her well, an energy, a directness, a quality of engagement with the world that made her good at her job in a way that went beyond technical competence. She had studied broadcast journalism. She had found her way to Press TV, the Iranian state-funded English-language news network, and had spent the better part of her adult working life in places that most people only encountered as datelines at the top of news reports. Iraq, Syria, Ukraine. The kinds of assignments that the less experienced and less committed decline, and the very good ones take without hesitation. She had a husband. She had 2 children, a son who was 4 years old, and a daughter who was 2. She was the household's primary earner. She was, by the autumn of 2014, a seasoned war correspondent who had covered multiple active conflicts and who understood, better than most people in her profession, the specific texture of danger in a zone where the lines between combatants and civilians and journalists and intelligence assets were in constant flux. She had found something on the Turkish border that she believed was important, more than important. She believed it was a story that implicated a NATO member government in one of the most significant intelligence failures or deliberate policy decisions, depending on how you read the evidence of the entire Syrian conflict. Here's the critical detail. In the days leading up to October 17, 2014, Shim had been working a source and working a location, and what she said she had found was this trucks. Specifically, trucks bearing the insignia of the World Food Program, the United Nations Humanitarian Relief Organization, crossing the Turkish border into Syria at a specific crossing point called Bab al-Hawa. And inside those trucks, she said, were not food supplies. They were fighters. Men, she described, on camera, as identifiable by their appearance and their clothing as Takfiri militants, the term used in Arabic to describe the specific jihadist ideology associated with groups like the Islamic State and Jabhat al-Nusra. She said she had filmed them. She said she had images. She said she believed she was among the first journalists, if not the first journalist, to document this specific crossing route. And on October 17, 2014, 2 days before she died, she said all of this on live television. The broadcast exists. It has been archived. It is watchable. And watching it now, knowing what happened 2 days later, it has a quality that is very difficult to describe accurately without resorting to the word premonition, which is not quite right, because what Shim said in that broadcast was not a premonition. It was a direct and specific statement of fear based on direct and specific events that had already occurred. She said that Turkish intelligence, the Milli İstihbarat Teşkilatı, the MIT, had accused her of being a spy, that the accusation had come in direct response to her reporting on the border crossings, that she was frightened about what Turkish authorities might do with that accusation. She referenced a designation that Reporters Without Borders had given to Turkey, the largest prison for journalists in the world, a designation based on the number of journalists then imprisoned by the Turkish government. She said, in words that were calm and professional and precise in the way that the words of a good journalist are, even when they are describing something that is terrifying, I am a bit frightened about what they might use against me. She said this on live television, to an audience watching in real time, on the record. 48 hours later, she was dead. This is where it stops being normal, and it begins with the crash itself, which in the official Turkish account is a straightforward traffic accident, and in almost every other account is a sequence of events that accumulates contradictions, the way a crime scene accumulates evidence. October 19, 2014. Shim and her 16-year-old cousin Judy Irish were traveling by car near the town of Suruç, returning from a location where Shim had been preparing material for a report. Irish was driving. Shim was in the passenger seat. A cement mixer truck struck the vehicle. The collision was serious enough to be fatal to one occupant and minor enough to leave the other with injuries that did not require extended hospitalization. Serena Shim, the passenger, did not survive. Judy Irish, the driver, was treated and released. In the immediate aftermath, the accounts of what had happened began to diverge in ways that should have triggered immediate and serious scrutiny, and largely did not. Early reports stated that Shim had died at the scene of the crash. Later reports stated that she had been transported to a hospital and had died there of cardiac arrest, heart failure, unrelated to the collision injuries. These two accounts cannot both be accurate. A person either dies at a crash scene or dies later at a hospital. The cause of death listed in those two accounts, traumatic injury versus cardiac arrest, are not the same thing and are not reconcilable without explanation. No explanation was provided. The hospital Shim was taken to was in Şanlıurfa, a city more than 30 miles from the location of the crash and more than 30 miles from the hospital where Judy Irish, the other occupant of the vehicle, was treated. The injured driver was taken to a local medical facility near the crash site. The fatally injured passenger was transported over an hour's drive away to a different city. No explanation for this routing decision was ever provided by Turkish medical or emergency services authorities. Now this is where the case turns dark. The cement truck driver, a man named Şükrü Salan, was not identified in the immediate aftermath of the crash. Turkish media reported, in the day or two following the collision, that the driver had left the scene and could not be located. He was eventually identified and located approximately 2 days after the crash. Turkish authorities investigated. An official report was produced. The report concluded that Salan bore no responsibility for the collision, that the fault lay entirely with Judy Irish, the 16-year-old driving the car, who was found to have entered a junction at excessive speed and in violation of lane markings. Salan was briefly detained. A criminal prosecution of Salan was opened, and then closed without charges. The case was concluded, but here's what does not make sense, and what Shim's family began documenting publicly in the weeks and months after her death, and what was never formally addressed by any Turkish authority or any international body with the standing to demand an answer. The photographs of Salan's cement truck changed. In the days following the crash, multiple Turkish media outlets published photographs purporting to document the damage to the vehicle involved in the collision. Shim's sister, Fatma Shim, examining those photographs as they were published across different outlets and different days, identified what she described as significant and unexplained variations. Different photographs, released at different times, showing different patterns and different degrees of damage to the truck. Not minor inconsistencies of the kind that come from photographs taken at different angles or in different lighting conditions. Variations substantial enough that she publicly questioned whether the photographs were all documenting the same vehicle from the same incident. These observations were made publicly and on the record. They were never formally addressed. Shim's mother, Judy Poe, traveled to Beirut to view her daughter's body before burial. What she said after viewing the body has been quoted in every serious account of this case, and it has never been explained. She said that her daughter's body showed no visible external trauma consistent with a high-speed vehicular collision. She said, and she said it directly and without qualification, to Fox News, on camera there was not a single mark on her. She said she absolutely believed her daughter had been killed deliberately. She said it was not an accident. She said this as a woman who had just looked at her daughter's body and found it did not look like what a fatal car crash looks like. The United States State Department's response to the death of an American citizen in a NATO ally country, under circumstances that the citizen's own family was publicly and loudly describing as suspicious, was minimal in a way that was itself notable. The department stated that it does not conduct investigations into deaths that occur overseas. The department did not contact the Shim family in the immediate aftermath of the death. A formal statement of condolence was not issued until approximately a month after Shim died, in 2016, when the family formally renewed their request for a United States government investigation, citing the documented threats from Turkish intelligence that Shim had described on camera 2 days before her death. The State Department declined. The Committee to Protect Journalists investigated the circumstances of Shim's death and concluded, at that time, that there was no evidence to indicate it was anything other than a tragic accident. Her name does not appear in their database of confirmed journalism-related killings. Reporters Without Borders reached a similar conclusion. If you're new here, hit subscribe. New cases come out every week. There is no verified account of what happened to the footage Shim said she had filmed. She said on camera that she had images of fighters in World Food Program trucks crossing the border. Whether that footage was on her person or in her equipment at the time of the crash, whether it survived the crash, whether it was seized, whether it was destroyed, whether it was transmitted before her death to colleagues or to her network, all of that is officially unknown. The footage has never been publicly released. No colleague or contact has come forward to confirm receiving it. The claim that it existed and documented what she said it documented has never been independently verified. It has also never been refuted. Her children were 2 and 4 years old when she died. They are teenagers now. The case has never been formally reopened by any government with the standing to investigate it. Her last words on camera, delivered in the professional calm of a correspondent who has learned to keep her voice steady even when steadiness is difficult. I've got images of them in World Food Program trucks. It was very apparent that they were fighters by their beards and by the clothes that they wore. 2 days later, she was gone. The footage is gone. Nobody knows where either of them went. Shim was a journalist who died in a war zone. The next man worked inside a government not reporting on the system, but employed by it, and watched organized crime funnel hundreds of millions of dollars through casino floors he was paid to police. When he tried to tell someone, the system did not come for him with a cement truck or a borrowed gun. It did something quieter, and in some ways more complete. It made him disappear from the record entirely. Vancouver, British Columbia, 2015. The casino floor at River Rock, the flagship property of Great Canadian Gaming Corporation, sitting in the suburb of Richmond, just south of the city, across the Fraser River, is one of the busiest gambling facilities in Canada. It runs 24 hours. It is professionally managed, government-regulated, and operated under a licensing framework administered by the BC Lottery Corporation, the provincial Crown Corporation responsible for ensuring that British Columbia's gambling industry operates within the law. There are surveillance cameras covering every table. There are compliance officers whose job it is to identify suspicious transactions. There are federal anti-money laundering regulations that require casinos to report large cash transactions and to know their customers and to refuse service to anyone whose funds appear to derive from criminal activity. And on any given night in the mid-2010s, men and women were walking through the front doors of River Rock Casino, carrying plastic shopping bags stuffed with bundled Canadian $20 bills. Not credit, not wire transfers, not chips purchased through a cage transaction that left a paper trail, cash. Physical currency in denominations small enough that each individual bill was unremarkable, and large enough in aggregate that the bags holding them were heavy. Hundreds of thousands of dollars at a time, arriving in shopping bags, exchanged for chips, or for larger denominations, or simply cycled through the minimum required gambling activity and cashed out as documented winnings. Clean money, exiting a facility that had received dirty money, with a paper trail that said the funds had been won at a licensed, government-regulated casino. The money was drug money. It was gang money. It was the proceeds of organized criminal activity primarily from networks connected to Chinese organized crime operating across British Columbia, but also involving Mexican cartel funds and proceeds from local gang operations, and it was being laundered through the casino system at a scale and with a visibility that made the operation, in the assessments of the investigators who documented it, almost contemptuous of the regulatory framework that was supposed to prevent it. The men carrying the bags were not hiding. The transactions were not concealed. The cash was handed across tables in plain view of surveillance cameras operated by the same government corporation that was supposed to be stopping it. The reason it was not being stopped was not a failure of detection. It was a failure of will. And Ross Alderson, for 2 years, sat at the center of that failure and documented it with the thoroughness of a man who believed that documentation was sufficient, that if he simply showed the evidence to the people responsible for acting on it, they would act. Alderson was an Australian national who had spent years working in British Columbia's gaming compliance sector before being appointed Director of Anti-Money Laundering Investigations at BCLC in 2015. His background was in financial crime detection. He understood how money moved through systems designed to obscure its origins. He understood what suspicious transaction patterns looked like and what they meant and what the appropriate regulatory response to them was. He had, in other words, exactly the skills his position required, and from his first weeks in the role, he began using them. Here's the critical detail. What Alderson found was not ambiguous. It was not the kind of marginal or borderline activity that requires judgment calls and weighing of competing interpretations. The transactions he was documenting were straightforward violations of federal law. Patrons arriving with shopping bags of cash and exchanging amounts that triggered mandatory reporting thresholds. Patrons who, when asked to provide identification and source of funds documentation, as required under anti-money laundering regulations, identified themselves on casino records as housewives, or students, or unemployed occupational categories inconsistent with the possession of hundreds of thousands of dollars in physical currency. Casino managers who were aware of these patrons and their transactions and who were, in Alderson's assessment, not merely failing to enforce the rules, but actively accommodating the violation of them. He wrote reports. He filed internal complaints through the proper channels. He named specific individuals, specific casino staff, specific patrons, specific transaction patterns, and he attached documentation. He requested that the cases be referred for law enforcement action. He followed the process that the BCLC's own compliance framework specified. And the response, consistently and repeatedly, was to override him. Casino directors disputed his findings. His supervisors characterized his concerns as overstated or procedurally improper. When he identified a specific incident at River Rock, a patron exchanging approximately $100,000 in cash at the cage without engaging in any meaningful gambling activity, in what Alderson characterized as a textbook example of the layering stage of money laundering, and when he attempted to have his team question that, patron casino management intervened. The intervention was not a request for more documentation or a referral to a different process. It was a direct instruction to stop. The patron left the casino with cleaner money than they had arrived with. Alderson filed another report. This is where it stops being normal, because by this point the pattern was no longer simply one of regulatory indifference. It was one of coordinated institutional resistance to the enforcement of laws that the institution was specifically and legally obligated to enforce. And the question that Alderson could not stop asking, the question that would eventually be asked by a public inquiry with the power to compel answers, was why? Why was the BCLC, a government crown corporation, systematically suppressing anti-money laundering enforcement on casino floors it regulated? The answer, as it emerged across years of investigation and public inquiry testimony, was revenue. The BC Lottery Corporation received a percentage of the gross gaming revenue generated by the casinos it regulated. The casinos generated more gross gaming revenue when high-volume cash players were accommodated than when they were refused or reported. The provincial government received a share of BCLC's revenues. The financial incentive structure, at every level from the casino floor to the provincial treasury, pointed in the same direction. Accommodate the cash, look the other way at the bags, process the transactions, take the percentage. Alderson was an obstacle to that incentive structure, and the institution's response to him was not to engage with his findings or to dispute them on their merits. It was to sideline him, override him, and make clear that the work he was doing was unwelcome. By October 2017, he had had enough. He resigned. His resignation letter was the kind of document a careful man writes when he understands it will eventually be read in a public proceeding. It cited the vindictive nature and political posturing of certain stakeholders within the organization. It noted that he had experienced significant personal health deterioration as a result of the working environment. It was measured and it was precise, and it was the letter of a man who was protecting himself legally while making clear to anyone reading carefully that what he had experienced was not a simple professional disagreement. Before he left, he made a copy of his documentation. He saved files to an external hard drive and took it with him when he cleared his desk. And then, through an intermediary, he made contact with a journalist. Sam Cooper was an investigative reporter at Global News, a Canadian broadcast organization who had been reporting on money laundering in British Columbia's real estate and gaming sectors for years. Alderson provided Cooper with documentation. Cooper reported on it. The reporting was specific, was sourced, and was damning. It named facilities, named transaction patterns, named the regulatory failures that had allowed the system to operate. It triggered political consequences almost immediately. The provincial government, which had changed hands in the 2017 election, commissioned an independent review. That review, completed in 2018, produced findings serious enough that the government appointed a full public inquiry. The Cullen Commission of Inquiry into Money Laundering in British Columbia was established in 2019. It was given broad powers to compel testimony and examine documents. It was, in significant part, a direct consequence of what Ross Alderson had taken from his office on the day he resigned. But here's what does not make sense, and this is the part of Alderson's story that moves it from the category of institutional whistleblowing into something stranger and harder to categorize. By the time the Cullen Commission needed him, he was gone. A summons was issued for Alderson in March 2020. He did not respond. Not a legal challenge, not a request for extension, not a communication through counsel explaining his position. Simply silence. His email addresses were not responding. His phone was not responding. He had left Canada in 2018 and returned to Australia, and beyond that geographic fact, the Commission could not locate him. Commission counsel Patrick McGowan described the effort to find Alderson in open proceedings as an international manhunt. That phrase, an international manhunt, used by a lawyer in a formal public inquiry to describe the process of trying to serve a subpoena on a witness, is worth sitting with for a moment. The man who had made the inquiry necessary had become the inquiry's most elusive witness. For over a year, the Commission could not reach him. Now this is where the case turns dark, not with violence, not with a body or a crime scene, but with the particular darkness that comes from a man who has been broken by a system and has simply stopped engaging with it entirely. His colleagues who testified before the commission described what they had seen of Alderson in his final months at BCLC and in the period immediately following his resignation. Fellow investigator Daryl Tottenham, who had worked directly with Alderson, testified about a goodbye lunch in January 2018, a gathering for departing colleagues that Alderson attended. Tottenham said Alderson had not seemed like himself, that the years of raising alarms that were ignored, of filing reports that were overridden, of watching the institution he worked for systematically undermine the work he was employed to do, had left a visible mark, that he appeared to be suffering from significant mental health deterioration, that he was not the same man who had arrived at BCLC in 2015, full of professional confidence in the system's capacity to function as it was supposed to. The commission eventually located Alderson at a beach resort hotel in Australia. The specific mechanism by which he was communicating with them through a hotel courier, rather than directly, is a detail that resists simple interpretation. It could be the behavior of a man protecting himself from the legal exposure that came with his document leak. It could be the behavior of a man who had concluded, after everything, that no institution was trustworthy enough to engage with directly. It could be both of those things, simultaneously. In September 2021, he testified remotely, by video link from Australia. 4 hours of testimony. He confirmed that he had taken documents. He confirmed that he had provided them to a journalist. He said he would do it again. He said, "We would not be here today if I had not." When Commission counsel pressed him on why he had been unreachable for over a year, why an international manhunt had been required to serve him with a summons, he said, "I was not exactly hiding in a cave in Afghanistan. I was in Australia, paying taxes." The Attorney General of British Columbia described Alderson's document leak as potentially illegal. The Commission simultaneously credited those same documents as the foundation of the entire inquiry. Both of those things are in the official record. The man who leaked the documents was described as a potential criminal and as an essential catalyst in the same institutional breath. The Commission's final report was released on December 15, 2021. It confirmed that systematic, large-scale money laundering had occurred in British Columbia's casinos for years. It confirmed that regulatory failures had been systemic and that political pressure had contributed to those failures. It confirmed that hundreds of millions of dollars in criminal proceeds had moved through facilities operated under provincial government oversight, generating revenue that flowed to government coffers. The casinos paid fines. The government acknowledged failures. Regulatory reforms were announced. And Ross Alderson, the man who made all of it visible, who carried the documents out in a hard drive on the day he resigned and handed them to a journalist, and thereby triggered years of public reckoning. He issued no public statement after his testimony concluded. He has not spoken publicly since. His current circumstances, his current location, his current state of mind are unknown. He walked away from Vancouver in 2017 and kept walking. The next man was found dead on a high school campus in Los Angeles, and he had been missing for over a year before anyone found him. Los Angeles, April 2021. Griffith Park sits in the hills above the eastern edge of the city, like a piece of the wild that got left behind when everything around it was paved. 2,000 acres of dry chaparral and oak woodland and hiking trails that start at the edges of dense neighborhoods and within a few hundred yards become something genuinely remote, the kind of terrain where the city is visible from the ridgelines, but the city's logic stops applying the moment you step off the maintained path. The trails go quiet fast. The brush is thick enough that things can disappear into it without much effort. The park has always had that quality of being a place where the boundary between the ordinary world and something less ordered is closer than it appears from the road. On April 6, 2021, a red Mini Cooper was last seen on Riverside Drive at the eastern edge of the park. The man who had been driving it walked into that landscape and did not come back. Not that day. Not the week after. Not for 13 months. His name was Val Broxmeyer. He was 45 years old. To understand what Val Broxmeyer was doing in Los Angeles in the spring of 2021, what he had been doing for the previous 7 years, what had brought him from a life as a working musician to the middle of one of the largest banking fraud investigations of the Trump era. You have to start with his father, and with a morning in London in January of 2014. Bill Broxmeyer was 58 years old. He had spent the latter part of his career at Deutsche Bank, one of the largest and most systemically consequential financial institutions in the world, where he had risen to a senior position in the risk management division. He was, by multiple accounts from people who worked with him, exceptionally good at his job, a man with a genuine analytical gift for understanding the risk structures embedded in complex financial instruments. The kind of person an institution like Deutsche Bank needed, precisely because the instruments it was trading in the 2000s were complex enough that most of the people selling them did not fully understand what they were selling. He had been considered for a position on the bank's management board. He had not been appointed, for reasons that were described in internal communications as relating to concerns from regulators. He had retired from the bank in 2012. On January 26, 2014, Bill Broxmeyer was found dead at his home in the South Kensington neighborhood of London. He had taken his own life. He was 58 years old. The manner of death was not disputed. The circumstances were not mysterious. What Bill Broxmeyer did in dying was leave behind an email archive. Val Broxmeyer was his adoptive son. He was 38 years old in January of 2014, a musician who had been living in Los Angeles, whose relationship with his father had been complicated in the ways that adoptive parent and adult-child relationships sometimes are, and who found himself, in the administrative aftermath of his father's death, with access to Bill Broxmeyer's personal email account. He began reading it. What he found was not what he expected to find. What he found, in the inbox and the sent folder, and the archived correspondence of a senior Deutsche Bank executive who had spent the previous decade at the center of one of the world's most powerful and troubled financial institutions, was a documentary record of a bank that was not operating the way a bank was supposed to operate. Board communications, internal risk assessments, correspondence with regulators, financial records from Deutsche Bank's operations in multiple jurisdictions, and at the center of it, the thread that connected the documents to a story that was already, by 2014, beginning to emerge in public reporting, a set of records relating to a money laundering scheme run through Deutsche Bank's Moscow branch. The scheme was called mirror trading, and it was elegant in its simplicity. Russian clients would purchase Russian stocks through Deutsche Bank's Moscow office, paying in rubles. Simultaneously, a related entity would sell the same stocks through Deutsche Bank's London office and receive payment in dollars. No actual investment activity was occurring. The transactions were circular. What was being accomplished was the conversion of rubles, which could not easily leave Russia due to capital controls, into dollars, which could go anywhere. The scheme moved an estimated $10 billion out of Russia through Deutsche Bank between 2011 and 2015. It generated hundreds of millions of dollars in commissions for the bank, and it violated, in the assessment of multiple regulatory agencies in multiple countries, a significant number of laws. Here's the critical detail. Val Broxmeyer did not sit on what he found. He did not consult a lawyer. He did not contact Deutsche Bank. He did not go to the press first, or the FBI first, or Congress first. He went to all of them, in overlapping and sometimes chaotic sequence, over the course of several years, sharing documents, making himself available as a source, and doing it in the specific way of a man who understood that he had something important and was not entirely sure what to do with it, but was absolutely certain it should not stay hidden. He went to the New York Times, where a reporter named David Enrich had been investigating Deutsche Bank's operations and would eventually write a book called Dark Towers that made Broxmeyer one of its central figures. He went to Fusion GPS, the Washington research firm connected to the Steele dossier and to the broader investigation into Russian money flows into American political and financial life. He was introduced by the musician Moby to Adam Schiff, then the ranking member, and later the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, which subpoenaed him. He went to the FBI's New York field office, which was running its own investigation into Deutsche Bank's money laundering operations. and which, after initial skepticism about Broxmeter's motives and reliability, came to regard him as a significant cooperative source. The FBI gave him what was described in reporting as a special advisory title. The Bureau helped his French girlfriend obtain a United States visa as part of the cooperative arrangement. He was, by the mid-2010s, functioning as a source for Congress, an informant for the FBI, a source for the New York Times, and a cooperating witness in a federal investigation simultaneously, without any of those parties necessarily knowing the full extent of his engagement with the others. He was also, during this same period, a man whose personal life was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. The opioid dependency that had been part of his life for years was not in remission. He had been involved in the distribution of files from the 2014 Sony Pictures hack, an involvement that created its own legal exposure and its own complicated relationship with federal investigators who wanted his Deutsche Bank documents and were not particularly interested in facilitating consequences for his other activities. He had been arrested for credit card fraud. He had accumulated legal problems and financial problems and personal problems in the way that a person does when the scaffolding of a stable life has been removed piece by piece over a long period of time. His relationship with the FBI had also become complicated in a specific and consequential way. In 2020, Broxmeter attended a meeting with FBI agents in Los Angeles. During the meeting, he came to believe, and whether his belief was accurate is genuinely unknown, that the agents were attempting to use him to set up Barrett Brown, an investigative journalist and activist who had himself been prosecuted for activities related to the anonymous hacking collective and who was, in Broxmeter's reading of the conversation, being targeted through him. Broxmeter nearly agreed to whatever was being proposed. Then he changed his mind. He had been recording the meeting. He posted the recording online. This is where it stops being normal, because posting a recording of an FBI meeting online is not the behavior of a man who expects his relationship with federal law enforcement to continue smoothly. It was an act of rupture, deliberate or impulsive, and it changed the nature of his position in fundamental ways. He was no longer simply a cooperative source with complicated personal circumstances. He was now a former cooperative source who had publicly embarrassed the Bureau and who had demonstrated a willingness to make private intelligence conversations public. His usefulness as an asset had been, at minimum, significantly complicated. On April 19, 2021, the LAPD issued a public statement requesting help from the community in locating a missing person. Val Broxmeyer had been reported missing by his family. He was last seen April 6th in Griffith Park. His red Mini Cooper had been recovered from Riverside Drive. He had not been found with it. But here's what does not make sense, and what made this disappearance different from the thousands of other missing person cases that the LAPD processes every year. After he vanished, his Twitter account kept moving. Journalists who had worked with Broxmeyer, who had his contact information, who had communicated with him regularly over the previous years, reported receiving messages from the account in the months after he disappeared. Scott Stedman of Forensic News stated publicly that he had been in communication with Broxmeyer as late as January 2022, 9 months after the LAPD had publicly stated that Broxmeyer was missing and that his car had been found without him. Whether those communications originated with Broxmeyer himself, a man who was alive and hiding, a man who had chosen to disappear rather than been taken, or with someone who had access to his accounts, or with automated activity, has never been established. The account activity was noted. It was never investigated or explained by any official body. Now this is where the case turns dark. In the months before he was found, while he was technically still a missing person, Broxmeyer had apparently been present in Los Angeles in a way that was visible to at least some people around him. In early 2022, he was arrested by LAPD officers for possession of a privately manufactured firearm, a ghost gun, assembled without serial numbers, not registered to any owner in any database. Separately, residents of an arts complex in the Lincoln Heights neighborhood of Los Angeles, called the Brewery Art Colony, filed for a restraining order against him, alleging that he had threatened them with that weapon as part of a pattern of harassing conduct. And that's the last confirmed time anyone saw Val Broxmeyer alive, or at least the last time anyone described a meaningful interaction with him. Because on April 25, 2022, a cleaning crew arrived at the campus of Woodrow Wilson High School on Multnomah Street in the El Sereno neighborhood of Los Angeles, and they found a body on the school grounds. School police stated that they had no surveillance footage of the individual entering the campus. They could not determine how long the body had been there. The body was identified as Val Broxmeyer. He was 46 years old. LAPD Captain Kenneth Cabrera told the Los Angeles Times that investigators did not suspect foul play. The case was referred to the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner Coroner. The office logged the case and deferred a preliminary finding pending additional examination and toxicology testing. In all publicly available records accessed in the course of researching this script, the cause of death for Val Broxmeyer remains listed as not determined. Here's the contradiction that will not let go, and that sits at the center of everything else in this case. The federal government of the United States gave Val Broxmeyer a special advisory title. It helped his girlfriend get a visa. It built cases on his documents. It invited him before Congress. Deutsche Bank ultimately paid billions of dollars in fines across multiple jurisdictions in proceedings that drew directly on the kind of documentation Broxmeyer had provided. And then, when his life collapsed, when he was homeless and struggling with addiction and carrying a ghost gun and threatening people in an art colony and apparently living rough in a city that is very efficient at rendering people invisible, when they cease to be convenient, there is no record of any federal agency, any congressional committee, any institution that had benefited from his cooperation doing anything at all to locate him or assist him during the 13 months he was missing. His usefulness had run out. His circumstances had become complicated. And in the gap between those two facts, Val Broxmeyer ceased to be a person that the record was maintaining any interest in. His documents are public. His testimony is on record. The bank paid. The inquiries concluded. The book is in libraries. And the man who made all of it possible is listed in his own Wikipedia article with a cause of death that reads simply, "Not determined." The documents survived. The man who found them did not. Broxmeyer died in a city that is very good at losing people. The next person survived, but only barely, and to do it, he had to climb a wall in total darkness, alone, with a broken ankle, blind, and then evade the most comprehensive state surveillance apparatus that has ever been deployed against a single family in a rural Chinese village. Dongshigu Village, Shandong Province, China, April 2012. The village is small in the way that rural Chinese villages are small. A cluster of low buildings set into agricultural land, connected to the larger world by roads that are unpaved at the edges and by relationships that have existed between the same families for generations. Shandong is one of China's most populous provinces, dense and flat in its eastern reaches, where it meets the Yellow Sea, and Linyi, the prefecture-level city, in whose jurisdiction Dongshigu sits, is a place most people outside China would have no reason to know. It is not a tourist destination. It is not an economic hub. It is the kind of place that exists in the interior of large countries in large numbers, doing the ordinary work of ordinary life, invisible to the outside world. It had become, by the spring of 2012, one of the most watched pieces of geography on Earth. Not because of what was in it, because of who was in it and what had been done to keep him there. The house where Chen Guangcheng and his family lived had been under guard for nearly 2 years. The guards were not police officers in uniform. They were not operating under any formal legal authority. They were hired men, local residents paid by the local Communist Party apparatus to maintain a perimeter around the property, to turn away visitors, to prevent anyone from approaching the house and, critically, to prevent anyone inside the house from leaving it. The arrangement had no legal basis in Chinese law. It was not a formal detention. It was not an officially acknowledged restriction of movement. It was simply men standing outside a house day and night, being paid to be there, answerable to local party officials who were themselves answerable to a provincial apparatus that had decided, after Chen Guangcheng was released from prison in 2010, that his physical containment was preferable to the alternative. The alternative was Chen Guangcheng free, to understand why the Chinese state was willing to maintain this legally indefensible, internationally embarrassing, resource-intensive operation for 2 years, to understand why a government that controlled the largest law enforcement and surveillance apparatus in the world felt it necessary to station hired guards around the house of a blind man in a rural village. You have to understand what Chen Guangcheng had done and what he knew and what he was capable of if he were free to act. Chen Guangcheng was 40 years old in the spring of 2012. He had been blind since infancy, the result of a fever that destroyed his vision before he was a year old, and that, in the rural Shandong of the 1970s, went untreated long enough to cause permanent damage. He grew up as the fifth of 5 brothers in a family with no particular resources or connections. The village called him Blind Five, a nickname that carried in it the particular casual cruelty of communities that assign people fixed identities before those people have had a chance to become anything. He became something. He taught himself, through a process that his own memoir describes with a matter-of-factness that makes it more rather than less astonishing, to navigate a legal system. He could not read in documents. He could not see in courts. He had never been formally trained to appear in. He became what the Chinese legal community called a barefoot lawyer, an advocate operating outside the formal professional structure, helping rural farmers and disabled citizens and people with no other recourse to use the legal mechanisms that the Chinese state claimed to have established for their benefit. He was good at it. He was exceptionally good at it. In the way that people who learn something through necessity, rather than institutional training, sometimes become good with a directness and a practicality that bypassed the formal conventions and got to the functional core of what the law actually said. In 2005, Chen and a team of associates began investigating the enforcement of the one-child policy in Linyi Prefecture. What they found was not what the policy's official description suggested. The one-child policy, as formally articulated, permitted the state to impose fines on families who exceeded the birth limit and, in theory, to provide family planning services including voluntary sterilization and contraception. What was happening in Linyi was different in kind from that description, not just in degree. Local officials had organized systematic campaigns operating around the clock, involving multiple agencies, using physical force as a primary, rather than a last resort, to compel compliance with birth quotas through means that had no basis in any law. Women who were believed to be pregnant, in violation of the quota, were detained. Some were subjected to forced abortions at full term at 8 and 9 months of pregnancy. Others were forcibly sterilized. Family members of women who could not be found were detained and held as leverage. The operations had the organized quality of a military campaign rather than a regulatory enforcement action. Chen documented it. He documented it systematically and in detail, individual cases, named individuals, specific incidents with dates and locations, and the identities of the officials who had ordered and carried out the operations. He organized the affected families into a class action lawsuit. He named local Communist Party officials as defendants. He filed the lawsuit through the Chinese court system, the same court system that the Chinese government maintained as evidence of the rule of law in the People's Republic. Here's the critical detail. His crime, in the eyes of the state, was using the legal system as it was designed to be used. The lawsuit was filed. The documentation was assembled. The names were named. And the response of the local party apparatus, with the knowledge and acquiescence of the provincial apparatus above it, was to use the same legal system to destroy him. In 2006, Chen was convicted of damaging property and organizing a mob to disrupt traffic. The charges derived from a protest that Chen had helped organize, interpreted under the most expansive possible reading of the relevant statutes. He was sentenced to 4 years and 3 months in prison. International legal observers who examined the trial record described it uniformly as a fabrication. The charges were invented. The conviction was predetermined. The sentence was a message. He served the full sentence. He was released in September 2010. He went home to Dongshigu, and the guards were already there. The international attention was already there too. The Ramon Magsaysay Award, one of the most significant human rights recognitions in Asia, sometimes called the Asian Nobel Prize, had been awarded to Chen while he was still in prison. His wife, Yuan Weijing, had attempted to travel to the award ceremony to accept on his behalf. Her passport had been confiscated at the airport. The award was noted internationally. In the house in Dongshigu, nothing changed. In December 2011, the actor Christian Bale and a CNN crew drove to the village. Bale had said publicly that he wanted to meet Chen, wanted to shake his hand, wanted to express in person the international recognition that the wall of guards around his house was designed to deny him. The guards intercepted the vehicle before it reached the house. What followed was 40 minutes of pursuit guards chasing the CNN vehicle along rural roads, throwing objects at it, trying to force it to stop. The footage was filmed from inside the car and broadcast internationally. Inside the house in Dongshigu, nothing changed. In February 2011, Chen and Yuan Weijing had managed to film a video documenting their conditions. They described the guards, the perimeter, the physical assaults that had been used against Yuan Weijing when she attempted to leave the property. Yuan Weijing described being knocked to the ground, held down, kicked. The video was uploaded and circulated online. The state's response was to send men into the house. They threw a heavy quilt over Yuan Weijing, dragged her into the courtyard, and beat her in front of her children. The message was clear and was clearly received. The documentation of what was happening would produce more of what was happening. Now this is where the case turns dark, because what Chen Guangcheng decided to do next was something that, considered from the outside, defies the categories of planning and execution that normally govern such decisions. He was blind. He had broken his ankle in a previous escape attempt, and the injury had not healed correctly. The guards operated in shifts, maintaining surveillance around the clock. The nearest city with any infrastructure relevant to what he was planning was not nearby. The network of activists that he would need to contact and coordinate with was itself under surveillance, its members known to state security services and subject to arrest the moment they moved to help him. He decided to escape anyway. He planned it for months. On the night of April 22, 2012, something changed in the guard rotation. Whether the men stationed outside the house were bribed, distracted, or simply negligent in a way that Chen had been watching for and was prepared to act on the moment it presented itself, that has never been established. What is established is that Chen moved. He climbed a wall he could not see, using his hands and his knowledge of the property's physical dimensions he had mapped by touch over the 2 years he had been confined to it. He fell. He got up. He kept moving through the dark on a foot that had never fully recovered from the previous attempt, navigating by sound and spatial memory and the particular kind of whole-body awareness that develops over a lifetime of moving through a world you cannot see. He had made arrangements in advance. Contacts were waiting at pre-agreed locations. He reached them. What followed was 6 days of movement across roughly 400 miles from rural Shandong to Beijing, conducted in vehicles and safe houses by a network of activists who understood that they were committing acts for which the Chinese state would imprison them, and who did it anyway. He Peirong, a Nanjing-based activist who had organized significant portions of the network, drove Chen toward Beijing. She was detained within days of his escape becoming public, disappeared into the state security system in the way that people disappear in China, not dramatically, not with public announcement, simply gone from the places they had been and unavailable at the numbers they had answered. Chen surfaced in the American embassy in Beijing 6 days after leaving Dongshigu. He had been carried the last portion of the route by people who understood that helping him might be the last significant act of public courage they would perform for a very long time. The embassy received him. The United States government found itself, within hours, in a situation it had not chosen and did not want. Hillary Clinton was days away from Beijing for high-level strategic and economic talks. The Obama administration was managing a relationship with China that encompassed trade, North Korea, Iran, Sudan, climate negotiations, and currency policy simultaneously. A blind activist who had just escaped extrajudicial house arrest by climbing a wall at night with a broken ankle was now inside American diplomatic territory, and the Chinese government was demanding his return, and the American government was trying to calculate how much this man's freedom was worth in the currency of everything else it needed from Beijing. This is where it stops being normal, because the calculation that followed, conducted over days of tense back-channel negotiation, produced an outcome that was presented as a victory for human rights, and that was, on closer examination, a transaction. Chen was permitted to leave China for the United States. He was given a fellowship at New York University. He and his family were eventually reunited in New York. He learned English. He wrote a memoir. He testified before Congress. He is alive. But here's what does not make sense. If what you are looking for is consistency between the principles the United States government articulated in advocating for Chen's freedom and the actions it was willing to take to secure it, He Peirong, who drove him to Beijing, was not part of the negotiated outcome. She remained in Chinese custody. The activists who had sheltered him, who had moved him from safe house to safe house across 400 miles, who had risked everything to get him to that embassy, were not part of the negotiated outcome. They were prosecuted. Some received prison sentences. Chen's nephew, Chen Guangcheng, who had fought back against plainclothes security officers who broke into his home in the immediate aftermath of the escape, who had picked up a knife and defended himself against men who had no legal authority to be in his home, was sentenced to more than 3 years in prison. The Chinese government never formally acknowledged the 2 years of extrajudicial house arrest. State media ran no coverage of the escape when it became public. Within 24 hours of the story appearing in international press, Chen's name was blocked on every major Chinese social media platform. The term blind man was blocked. The flight number of the aircraft that eventually carried him to the United States was blocked. The title of The Shawshank Redemption was blocked, because Chinese internet users had begun using it as a coded reference to what he had done. They blocked the idea of him before they could fully block the fact of him. The 600,000 people in Linyi whose cases Chen had documented in his lawsuit received no compensation. The local officials who had organized and overseen the campaign of forced sterilizations and forced abortions were never prosecuted. The guards who stood outside the house in Dongxigu for 2 years were never charged with anything. The legal system through which Chen had tried to seek accountability, the system that the Chinese government maintained was functional and fair, produced no accountability for any of the people who had destroyed his family's life for 6 years. Chen reached New York. He is alive. His wife is with him. His children are with him. By the measures that matter most to a person rather than a story, his ending is better than almost anyone else in this video. But the ending is not clean. It was never going to be clean. The price of his freedom was paid in full by the people who helped him get there, and the system that had imprisoned him and beaten his wife and held his family hostage for 2 years continued after he left, without meaningful consequence. He survived because he moved fast in the dark. What he left behind was everyone who helped him move. In Houston, the next man moved fast in daylight, and it cost him everything. Houston, Texas, April 29th, 2008. It is a Tuesday morning, in the kind of unremarkable late spring weather that Houston produces for months, at a stretch warm, hazy. The sky, the particular washed-out blue of a city that sits at the junction of Gulf Coast humidity and petrochemical atmosphere. The freeways are busy. The medical center, one of the largest concentrations of hospitals and research institutions in the world, is generating its usual mid-morning traffic on the streets around it. On Highway 288, heading south through that district, a traffic patrol officer named Charles Starks is running a routine speed enforcement operation, the kind that fills a shift's administrative log with unremarkable entries and generates a predictable stream of minor fines. At approximately 10 in the morning, Starks clocks a black Jeep Commander doing 75 miles per hour in a 60-mile-per-hour zone. He activates his lights and pulls the vehicle over. The Jeep moves to the shoulder. Starks approaches the driver's side window. He has no reason, at this moment, to expect anything other than a routine interaction, a license, a registration, an insurance card, 15 minutes of paperwork. The man behind the wheel announces immediately that he is an officer of the Central Intelligence Agency. His name was Roland Carnaby. He was 51 years old, Lebanese-American, silver-haired, and well-dressed in a dark suit on a Tuesday morning with no apparent professional appointment on his calendar that would explain the suit. He produced credentials. He held them up for Starks to see, but asked, specifically, that Starks not take the badge from him, citing national security reasons for the request. He provided a telephone number and told Starks that if he called it, someone there could verify his status. He added, in a qualification that should have registered as its own kind of signal, that it was probably nobody would be there to answer. Starks ran the vehicle's plates. The Jeep Commander was registered not to Roland Carnaby and not to any private entity. It was registered to something called the National Security Command Center. This was not a shell company or a generic-sounding corporate name. The National Security Command Center is an operational appendage of the National Security Agency, based at Fort Meade in Maryland. A routine traffic stop on a Houston freeway had produced a vehicle registered to a signals intelligence facility. Carnaby fled. He accelerated from a standing stop on the shoulder of the highway to nearly 120 miles per hour within seconds, merging into moving traffic and heading south at a speed that required the pursuing Houston police vehicles to drive dangerously, simply to maintain visual contact. The chase covered a significant distance through the streets of the medical center and surrounding neighborhoods before it ended. When it ended, Carnaby was out of the vehicle. Officers approached on foot. What happened in the precise seconds that followed is a matter of disputed account between the officers involved and the subsequent civil case brought by Carnaby's widow. The department maintained that Carnaby was reaching toward a weapon and that the officers perceived a genuine threat to their safety. The widow's legal team maintained that he was shot in the back, that the shooting was unjustified, and that what followed was worse. Roland Carnaby was shot. He was handcuffed on the pavement, face down. According to the civil complaint filed subsequently by his widow, Susan Carnaby, medical assistance was not called immediately. He was left on the pavement. He died on the street, approximately 6 blocks from the residential neighborhood where former President George Herbert Walker Bush maintained his Houston home. Here's the critical detail, and it is the one that every subsequent examination of this case has been unable to resolve cleanly. Within hours of Carnaby's death, before the scene had been fully processed, before any independent investigation had been initiated, before his widow had been formally notified, every federal agency that would have any knowledge of whether Roland Carnaby was what he claimed to be issued a public denial. The CIA spokesman Paul Gimigliano issued a statement. It said, "He was never a CIA officer." The formulation was absolute, not that his specific claimed role could not be confirmed, not that his current status was unclear, but that he had never, at any point, in any capacity, been connected to the CIA. The FBI followed with its own denial. The Secret Service followed. 3 agencies, coordinating their public statements with a speed and unanimity that itself implied coordination, said the same thing in the same terms, within the same window of time. We have no idea who this man is. This is where it stops being normal, because the evidence that accumulated in the days and weeks that followed told a story that was irreconcilable with the story those agencies had told. Paul Gimigliano, the CIA spokesman who had issued the denial, had his personal cell phone number in Carnaby's BlackBerry, not the agency's switchboard number, not a general press line. His personal number, the number a person stores when they have a direct, personal, operational relationship with someone. This fact emerged in the subsequent legal proceedings and was not disputed. Former FBI Special Agent Michael Bachot submitted a sworn deposition. He stated that he had used Roland Carnaby as a confidential informant. He described specific operational work that Carnaby had performed for him, specific intelligence that Carnaby had provided, specific circumstances under which the relationship had operated. This was not a casual recollection. It was a signed legal document, submitted under oath, in proceedings where the consequences of perjury were real. Former Secret Service officer James Napolitano submitted a separate sworn deposition, making substantively similar claims. He stated that Carnaby had performed undercover work for him, had worn a wire, had helped identify a man who was impersonating a federal officer, had operated as a cooperative source in a federal investigation. Again, sworn testimony, under oath, in legal proceedings. A private intelligence firm called Stratfor, whose internal communications were later published by WikiLeaks as part of a massive email disclosure, produced an internal message in the hours after Carnaby's death. The message was written by a senior Stratfor analyst and distributed to colleagues. It noted that a number of Stratfor personnel had spoken to Carnaby, that he had visited their offices, that he was known to people within the firm as an intelligence professional. The phrase the analyst used to describe his death was, "This is an odd event." It is a remarkable piece of understatement, the kind that emerges when a person is trying to be precise about something that is both factually true and deeply inadequate as a description of what they actually mean. And then there was the funeral. George Herbert Walker Bush attended Roland Carnaby's funeral. He was a pallbearer. George Herbert Walker Bush had been the director of Central Intelligence before he became vice president and then president. He understood, better than almost any living person at that moment, what the CIA's relationship to its contractors, its assets, and its deniable operatives looked like from the inside. He understood the practice of denial. He understood what it was for, and when it was used, and what it meant when it was deployed. He chose, in full knowledge of the CIA's public position, that this man had never been connected to the agency to carry his casket. Now this is where the case turns dark, because the physical evidence from the scene of Carnaby's death was handled in a way that has never been satisfactorily explained. Inside the Jeep Commander at the time it was stopped, officers found a significant collection of material: 2 pistols, a shotgun, documents that Carnaby had characterized as CIA credentials, multiple cell phones, and a laptop computer. This is an unremarkable inventory for a man doing the kind of work that multiple sworn depositions would subsequently confirm he had been doing. It is a very remarkable inventory for a man the CIA was simultaneously describing as having no connection to the agency whatsoever. Within hours of the shooting, while the scene was still active, before the standard forensic and evidentiary processes that govern a fatal officer-involved shooting had been completed, federal agents arrived. Not Houston police investigators with authority over the scene, not representatives of the county medical examiner. Federal agents, whose agency affiliation has never been publicly specified, who arrived and who took the laptop and the cell phones. Those devices were not processed as evidence in any Houston police investigation. They were not inventoried in the standard chain of custody documentation. They were not returned to Carnaby's widow when she requested them. They were taken by people with federal authority, and then they were gone. A gag order was placed on Carnaby's autopsy. In Houston, Texas, autopsy reports are public records. This is not a minor administrative convention. It is a transparency provision that applies to virtually every case handled by the Harris County Medical Examiner's Office, including officer-involved shootings, which are among the most politically sensitive cases the office processes. The provision exists specifically to ensure that deaths in which the government has a direct interest cannot be obscured by the government. An exception was made for Roland Carnaby. A gag order was issued, and the medical examiner's findings were sealed. They have not been released. The specific physiological facts of how Roland Carnaby died on a Houston street on the morning of April 29, 2008, are not part of the public record. But here's what does not make sense, and this is the detail that sits at the center of everything, the one that the official account produced by the city of Houston has never addressed. A Houston homicide captain, speaking to media in the period following the shooting, made a statement that was reported and then largely passed over in the coverage of the case. He said that he had been told, prior to the chase and the shooting, that Carnaby should be arrested for something other than the traffic violation. Not for the flight from the traffic stop, which was itself a serious criminal offense. Not for the weapons in the vehicle, which would have generated their own charges. For something else, something unspecified. Something that someone, somewhere in the chain of communication that preceded the stop, had determined needed to happen in connection with this specific individual on this specific morning. What was that something? Who communicated it? To whom? On whose authority? Why was it communicated before the traffic stop, which implies foreknowledge of who was in the vehicle? These questions were raised at the time. They were not answered. They have not been answered in the years since. The homicide captain made the statement, and it sits in the record of news coverage from 2008 as an unexplained detail that no subsequent investigation has picked up and followed. The Port of Houston, one of the busiest cargo facilities in the United States, handling container traffic from dozens of countries and serving as a critical node in the supply chains for the energy and petrochemical industries that dominate the Gulf Coast economy, sits a few miles from where Carnaby died. He had been, by multiple accounts from people who knew his work, conducting surveillance of the port, security surveys documenting what he assessed as significant vulnerabilities in Homeland Security's monitoring of cargo and personnel at the facility. He had installed cameras. He had been uploading footage to somewhere. The laptop that federal agents took from the Jeep commander may have contained that footage. It may have contained other things entirely. Whatever it contained has never been made public, and the people who took it have never said what they found. His widow's civil rights lawsuit against the city of Houston and the officers who shot her husband proceeded through the federal court system for years. The outcome of that litigation is not locatable in any public record accessed in the course of researching this script. Whether it was settled, dismissed, or resolved through some other mechanism is unknown. The terms, if there were terms, have not been made public. What remains is the specific shape of the silence that surrounds Roland Carnaby's death, a silence that is not the silence of an unsolved case or an institutional failure or even a cover-up in the ordinary sense of that word. It is the silence of a decision made quickly and maintained consistently for nearly 2 decades. Every agency that spoke chose the same word on the same day. Nobody. He was nobody. He was nothing to us. He was never here. And yet the president who had run the agency that denied him carried his casket. And the CIA spokesman, whose personal cell number was in his phone, denied knowing him. And the federal agents who arrived before the body was cold and took his computer never came back with it. And the autopsy that would tell us exactly how he died has been sealed behind a legal order that has never been lifted. The name of his security firm registered to a UPS store mailbox in a commercial strip mall was Carnaby Shipping Company. The Port of Houston continues to operate. Whatever was on the laptop continues to be whatever it was, in the possession of people who have decided that it will not become public record. And George H.W. Bush, who knew exactly what denial looked like and what it was for, chose to stand at that graveside anyway. Carnaby was shot on a highway in broad daylight. The last case on this list is still unfolding. As of this recording, no one has found him yet. Albuquerque, New Mexico, February 27, 2026. The Sandia Mountains rise to the east of the city in a wall of granite and compressed time. 500 million years of geological history visible in the banding of the rock face. The peaks reaching over 10,000 feet. The lower slopes covered in pinon pine and juniper, and the kind of high desert scrub that looks sparse from a distance and becomes, when you are inside it, genuinely difficult terrain. The city spreads west from the mountain base in the flat grid pattern of a mid-sized American city that grew fast in the post-war decades and never quite developed the density that would make it feel urban in the way that coastal cities feel urban. It is a place of wide streets and long sight lines and neighborhoods where the houses sit back from the road on generous lots and the mountains are visible from almost everywhere, a constant orientation point on the eastern horizon. It is also, for reasons that have everything to do with its proximity to Kirtland Air Force Base and Sandia National Laboratories and the broader infrastructure of the American nuclear and aerospace defense establishment, a city where retired military and intelligence professionals settle in significant numbers. People who spent careers inside classified programs, who built lives around proximity to the institutions that run those programs, who retire to a place where they can still feel the gravitational pull of that world without being fully inside it anymore. The city accommodates them without drawing attention to them. They live in the subdivisions in the northeast quadrant, in houses that look like every other house on the street, and the neighbors mostly do not ask what they used to do. Quail Run Court Northeast is one of those streets. Quiet, residential, unremarkable in every visible respect. A retired Air Force Major General had been living there for years, in a house that his wife would describe after his disappearance as an ordinary home in an ordinary neighborhood where he had been, until the morning of February 27th, an ordinary retired man. William Neil McCassland was 68 years old. He held a doctorate in astronautical engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He had spent 32 years in the United States Air Force, accumulating a record of service and advancement that took him from junior officer to 2-star general, from technical specialist to institutional leader. His most significant command assignment, and the one most relevant to understanding why his disappearance generated the kind of attention it generated, was his tenure as commander of the Air Force Research Laboratory at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. Wright-Patterson is not an ordinary military installation, and the Air Force Research Laboratory that McCassland commanded is not an ordinary research facility. The base has been a center of American aerospace and military technology development since the 1930s. Its Foreign Technology Division, which has operated under various names and organizational structures over the decades, has been responsible for the analysis and reverse engineering of foreign military hardware since the Second World War. And Wright-Patterson has occupied, for nearly 80 years, a specific and stubborn place in the most persistent strand of American conspiracy culture. Because of what witnesses and investigators and military personnel have claimed, across 8 decades of testimony and documentation and dying declarations, was brought there in the summer of 1947, the Roswell incident. The debris, the materials that were not like any materials in the cataloged inventory of American or Soviet aerospace technology in 1947. The biological specimens, in some accounts, all of it, according to a line of testimony that runs from military officers who were there to intelligence professionals who claimed access to the programs that followed, transported to Wright-Patterson for analysis and storage, and the kind of institutional amnesia that classified programs produce when they run long enough. McCassland commanded the laboratory that oversaw $2.2 billion in annual Air Force science and technology investment. He had security clearances commensurate with that command. He had access to classified programs that the public does not know about and that the Air Force has not described. In 2017, several years after his retirement, his name appeared in the WikiLeaks publication of emails from John Podesta's account. Podesta being the chairman of Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign and a documented, open advocate for the declassification of government records related to unidentified aerial phenomena. The emails showed McCassland had been in contact with Tom DeLonge, the musician and founder of To the Stars Academy, an organization dedicated to the public disclosure of government UAP information. McCassland had served as an unpaid consultant to DeLonge on questions of military and technical accuracy. The relationship had been limited and had, according to his wife, ended following the Russian hack of Podesta's emails and the public exposure of the correspondence. All of this is background. It is context. It is the reason that when William Neal McCassland disappeared from his home on the morning of February 27, 2026, the disappearance did not remain a private family matter or a local news story for more than a few days. Here is what happened on that morning, as reconstructed from the reporting and the statements made by his wife and by the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office in the weeks following. A repairman had come to the house to perform some maintenance work. McCassland was home. His wife, Susan McCassland Wilkerson, had a doctor's appointment and left while the repairman was still there. She was gone for approximately an hour. When she returned, the repairman had finished his work and left. The house was quiet. She looked for her husband. He was not there. She called out. She checked the rooms. She went through the house with the particular focused attention of a person who is not yet alarmed, but who has noticed something that does not fit the expected pattern of an ordinary morning. Her husband was not in the house. She went outside. His car was still there. She looked at the things he had left and the things he had not left, and she understood. Before she called 911, something about what had happened that she would put into words when the dispatcher answered. He had left his phone. He had left his prescription glasses, without which a 68-year-old man with deteriorating vision cannot navigate unfamiliar terrain with any confidence. He had left his wearable monitoring devices, a set of electronic health trackers that were not casual fitness accessories, but medically relevant tools for monitoring a condition that the sheriff's office would subsequently decline to specify publicly, characterizing it only as a medical condition that added urgency to the search. He had left the things that a person needs to function in the ordinary world, the things that a person needs to ask for help when they need it, the things that a person needs to stay safe when their health is fragile. He had taken his hiking boots, he had taken his wallet, and he had taken a .38 caliber revolver in a leather holster. When Susan McCassland Wilkerson spoke to the 911 dispatcher, She said something that has appeared in every subsequent news account of the disappearance, because it is the sentence around which every theory and counter-theory about what happened to her husband turns. She said that she believed he had planned not to be found. The Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office issued a Silver Alert, the emergency notification system used when a missing person over the age of 50 is believed to be in danger due to a cognitive or medical condition. The alert went public. Within days, the FBI had joined the search. The resources deployed were extraordinary by the standards of a missing person case. Dozens of ground searchers working organized grid patterns, horseback teams covering the trail systems on the lower slopes of the Sandias, 3 distinct types of search dogs deployed for different search functions, drone units running aerial grid patterns over the foothills and the desert scrub, helicopter support flying the ridgelines. Surveillance footage from neighborhood cameras and wildlife cameras in the surrounding terrain was collected and reviewed. Door-to-door canvassing was conducted across the neighborhoods adjacent to the search area. The Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office committed resources to this search that would be remarkable for the disappearance of any private citizen, let alone a retired military officer with no current official role. As of mid-March 2026, none of it had produced anything. No physical trace, no confirmed sighting, no evidence of any kind suggesting what had happened to William Neil McCassland in the hour between his wife leaving for her appointment and her returning to find him gone. Here's the critical detail, the one that lifted this case from the category of a tragic disappearance into something that attracted congressional attention and international press coverage, and the specific, urgent interest of people who spend their professional lives trying to understand what the United States government knows about unidentified aerial phenomena and why it has not said so publicly. The disappearance happened at a particular moment. In the weeks before McCassland vanished, President Donald Trump had announced that the United States government would initiate a process of declassifying and publicly releasing information related to UAPs, unidentified anomalous phenomena, the term that had largely replaced the older acronym in official government usage following years of congressional hearings, Freedom of Information Act litigation, and whistleblower testimony from military and intelligence officials who claimed first-hand knowledge of classified programs that went far beyond the public acknowledgement of unexplained aerial encounters. The announcement was the most significant public commitment to UAP disclosure that any sitting American president had made. It came in a political and institutional environment that was, for the first time in decades, treating the subject as a legitimate matter of national security policy rather than a fringe concern. In that environment, a retired Major General who had commanded the Air Force Research Laboratory at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, who had overseen classified aerospace and propulsion, and directed energy and materials programs, who had been in contact with UAP disclosure advocates and had been named in documents obtained by WikiLeaks in connection with those contacts. Disappearing from his home without a trace was not going to be treated as a private matter. Investigative journalist Ross Coulthart, a News Nation correspondent who had spent years reporting on UAP programs and their classified infrastructure, addressed the disappearance directly and in terms that were not designed to be calming. He said McCassland was a man with some of the most sensitive secrets of the United States government in his head. He described the disappearance as a grave national security crisis. He noted that McCassland was known within the UAP research and advocacy community as someone who was sympathetic to the principle of public disclosure, a man who, if he chose to speak, would have things to say that the public did not yet know, and that certain institutional interests would prefer the public never know. Republican Congressman Eric Burleson of Missouri stated publicly, and on the record, that McCassland has a lot of information regarding UFOs. He did not specify the basis for this characterization, but he said it, and he said it in the context of expressing concern about the disappearance, and it was reported and circulated widely. Now this is where the case turns dark, because the loudest voices pointing in one direction were met, consistently and specifically, by the quietest and most proximate voice pointing in another direction entirely, and that voice was Susan McCassland Wilkerson's. His wife addressed the speculation directly in a Facebook post that was quoted in multiple news accounts, and that deserves to be represented accurately because its precision and its specificity matter. She acknowledged that her husband had had access to highly classified programs and information during his Air Force career. She noted that he had retired nearly 13 years before his disappearance, and that his clearances in retirement were, in her description, very commonly held not the extraordinary special access credentials of a man with current involvement in sensitive programs. She said it seemed quite unlikely that he had been taken to extract very dated secrets from him. She addressed the UAP connection specifically, describing the Tom DeLonge consulting relationship as brief and unpaid and long concluded. She pushed back, with evident precision and evident pain, against the framework that was being constructed around her husband's disappearance by people who did not know him and who were using his biography as raw material for theories they had already decided they believed. And she had told the 911 dispatcher that she believed he had planned not to be found. This is where it stops being normal, because those two things, the wife's account and the physical evidence of what he left and what he took, are pointing in the same direction, and that direction is the one that is hardest to look at directly. A man with a medical condition and a gun, who left his glasses and his phone and his monitoring devices in the high desert terrain of the Sandia foothills. In late February, when the nights are cold and the ground is rough, and a 68-year-old man moving alone through that landscape without the ability to call for help is not moving through it safely. But here's what does not make sense, and it is the detail that will not resolve into either narrative cleanly. The search produced nothing. Not a body, not an article of clothing, not a boot print in the soil of the foothills. Not a single confirmed sighting from any of the cameras, or the drones, or the horseback teams, or the dozens of ground searchers who covered the terrain systematically over weeks. A man who left his home on foot, without a vehicle, without the ability to see clearly, in a suburban neighborhood adjacent to wilderness terrain, simply did not leave a trace that any of the resources deployed to find him could locate. In April 2026, the White House announced a formal investigative probe into a pattern of disappearances and deaths among individuals with high government security clearances and significant scientific or technical backgrounds. The probe named McCassland specifically. It named a materials engineer employed at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, who had died under circumstances described as unexplained. It named a Caltech astronomer. It named a fusion scientist affiliated with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The announcement did not allege a connection between the cases. It acknowledged that the pattern existed. It stated that the government considered the pattern worth formal examination. The fact of that announcement is itself something to sit with. The White House announcing a formal probe into whether a pattern of deaths and disappearances among cleared government scientists and officials constitutes something other than coincidence is not a routine administrative action. It does not happen unless someone, somewhere in the government, has looked at the pattern and concluded that it cannot be explained away by ordinary statistics. The announcement does not confirm a conspiracy. It confirms that the government has seen enough to think one might exist. As of this recording, Major General William Neil McCassland has been missing for more than 2 months. The search is ongoing. The White House investigation continues. No remains have been found. No evidence of foul play has been announced. No explanation has been provided. His glasses are on the table where he left them. His phone has not received a call that he could answer. His medical devices have not recorded a reading since the morning of February 27, 2026. Somewhere in the high desert east of Albuquerque, or somewhere else entirely, or nowhere that can be pointed to on any map, the answer to what happened to him exists. It has not been found. It may not be found. The search continues, and the silence continues, and the mountains to the east of the city continue to say nothing at all. There is a quiet street in Albuquerque where a pair of prescription glasses sits on a table. They have been there since February. Nobody has moved them. Moving them would require a decision that the people who love him are not yet ready to make a decision about what the continued presence of those glasses means. About whether waiting for a man who left without them is a form of hope or a form of denial. About what the table looks like when the glasses are gone and the waiting is over. So they stay, and the table holds them, and the mountains to the east say nothing. There is a bathtub in a top-floor flat in Pimlico, London, that was emptied and cleaned and eventually used by other people, Because buildings do not stop being buildings, and London did not pause for what happened in that bathroom. And the red bag, and the combination padlock, and the two unidentified DNA profiles that were never matched to any known person are part of a legal record that lives in a filing system somewhere and does nothing to change them. The fact that the coroner said probably murdered and the police said probably not, and both of those things are still simultaneously true and will apparently remain simultaneously true indefinitely. Two irreconcilable official positions sitting in the same archive like objects that cannot occupy the same space but somehow do. There is a river in upstate New York that has been running since before the country it borders was a country. In 1826, a carriage stopped at its edge in the dark, and what happened at the edge of that river has never been established by any court, any commission, any authority with the formal power to say so. The stone in Batavia says murdered. The river says nothing. The legal system, which had 200 years to produce an answer, and chose instead to produce a series of trials that convicted men of forcibly moving a person from one location to another and sentenced them to terms of 1 month to 2 years, says what legal systems say when they have decided that the full truth is more inconvenient than a partial accounting. Nothing further to add. 10 people, 10 cases, 2 centuries, 9 countries. Every kind of institution that human beings have constructed to organize and maintain power over other human beings, governments and intelligence agencies, and organized crime networks and military establishments and financial systems, and provincial regulatory bodies and secret societies that embedded themselves in the law enforcement and judiciary of an entire region of a young country. The settings change across this video. The decades change. The languages in the documents change. The methods change from a carriage in the night to a hotel window to a padlocked bag to a borrowed pistol to a cement truck to a laptop seized by federal agents to a man who walked into the desert with a gun and his hiking boots, left his glasses on the table. The shape of what happened does not change. Someone knew something, and then they were gone, or silenced, or broken, or made to disappear from the public record in one of the several ways that the public record accommodates disappearance. And the institutions that were supposed to ask the questions that would explain the disappearance chose, at the critical moment in every single one of these cases, not to ask them. Here's the thing that connects these 10 people, and it is not a conspiracy theory, and it does not require you to accept any single framework or any unified explanation or any shadowy organization operating across 2 centuries of documented human history. The connection is simpler than that. It is more durable than that. It is this. In every one of these cases, the specific institution most directly responsible for ensuring accountability, the sheriff, the intelligence agency, the coroner's timeline, the government that issued the initial ruling, the State Department, the police department, the Chinese censorship apparatus, the federal agents who arrived at the scene, the provincial regulatory body made a choice, not an error, not a failure, a choice. A choice about what questions to pursue and what questions to set aside, about what evidence to preserve and what evidence to allow to degrade or disappear, about what to confirm and what to leave, forever, in the category of officially unknown. The officially unknown is not a neutral category. It is not simply the absence of information. It is what you get at the end of a specific kind of institutional process, a process in which the questions that would produce an uncomfortable answer are asked once, loudly, for the record, and then quietly allowed to go unanswered until the window for answering them closes. It looks, from the outside, like an absence. It functions, in practice, like a decision. The hematoma that was not in the 1953 autopsy report was an absence of information. It was also a decision. The 16 days that MI6 waited before reporting Gareth Williams missing produced an absence of forensic evidence. It was also a decision. The sealed autopsy on Roland Carnaby is an absence of public record. It is also a decision made by someone with the authority to make it and the institutional protection to maintain it. What connects these 10 cases is not a conspiracy. What connects them is a pattern of institutional behavior, specific, documentable, repeated across different governments and different centuries, and different systems of law, in which the people and organizations responsible for protecting those who tell the truth chose instead to protect the systems those people were trying to expose. Now this is where these 10 cases, taken together rather than individually, become something harder to dismiss than any single story. In April 2026, the White House announced a formal investigative probe into a pattern of disappearances and deaths among individuals with high government security clearances and significant technical or scientific backgrounds. The probe named McCassland, it named others. The announcement did not allege a connection. But the act of formal governmental acknowledgement, the act of a White House saying we have noticed a pattern and we are examining it, is itself a data point that belongs in any honest accounting of what these cases mean. Together, the government of the United States has looked at a set of disappearances and deaths involving people who knew things the government classified, and it has decided that the pattern is worth an official look. That is not confirmation of wrongdoing. It is confirmation that wrongdoing is being considered as a possibility by the people whose institutional responsibility it is to consider such possibilities seriously. The question that runs under all of this, under the carriage at Fort Niagara and the hotel room on 7th Avenue, and the padlocked bag in the bathtub, and the draft warrant in the trash, and the cement truck on the road to Sourouse, the shopping bags full of 20s, and the red Mini Cooper at the edge of Griffith Park, and the blind man climbing a wall at night, and the CIA spokesman's cell number in a dead man's phone, and the glasses on a table. In Albuquerque, the question is not whether governments and powerful institutions silence people who know too much. The historical record has answered that question so many times, and in so many jurisdictions, and across so many centuries, that asking it feels almost redundant. The question is whether we are still in the middle of that history, or whether we have moved into something cleaner and more accountable, and more genuinely protective of the people who take the risk of telling the truth. The sealed autopsy in Houston suggests we have not moved. The officially undetermined cause of death of a federal informant found on a high school lawn in Los Angeles suggests we have not moved. The two simultaneously contradictory official verdicts about what happened to a man found in a padlocked bag in London suggests we have not moved. The unlocated body of a retired Air Force general in the New Mexico high desert, in a search that deployed FBI resources and horseback teams and 3 types of dogs and produced nothing, suggests we have not moved. But here's what does not make sense about how we talk about these cases, and it is the last critical detail, the one that matters most after everything else has been accounted for. Every single person in this video, in the period before they disappeared or died or went silent or walked into the desert, did the thing that democratic systems and open societies and the institutions built on the principle of accountability are theoretically designed to celebrate and protect. William Morgan wanted to publish a book. He used a printer and a copyright application and the legal mechanisms of a free press. Frank Olsen wanted to leave a job. He told his supervisor and told his wife and asked to be allowed to go. Gareth Williams did the work his agency employed him to do and went home to a flat and was found in a bag. Alberto Nisman filed a legal complaint through the court system and requested a congressional hearing through the proper channels. Serena Shim went on camera and told the truth about what she had filmed in the most public forum available to her, in real time, to a live audience. Ross Alderson filed internal reports and followed the compliance framework, and when that failed, went to a journalist and then cooperated with a public inquiry. Val Broxmeyer handed documents to the FBI and to Congress and to journalists and to everyone he could think of who had the authority and the institutional weight to do something with what he had found. Chen Guangcheng filed a class action lawsuit through the legal system that his government claimed to have established for exactly that purpose. Roland Carnaby, whatever he was, whatever he knew, whatever he had been doing on the road to the port of Houston, was a man who had made himself available to federal investigators and had operated as a confidential informant and had, if the sworn depositions of former FBI and Secret Service officers are to be believed, served the government that denied him. They used the systems, every one of them. They did not leak to foreign governments or engage in sabotage or take any action outside the legitimate channels that democratic societies provide for people who know things the public should know. They filed the complaints and gave the testimony and published the books, and went on camera, and handed over the documents, and climbed the walls, and told the truth in every venue, and through every mechanism available to them. And in case after case, the response of the institutions that received those disclosures was not protection. It was not gratitude. It was not the functioning of accountability as the systems described it. It was a traffic stop that escalated. It was a security detail that was quietly reduced. It was a doctor who was connected to the very program that was making the patient want to leave. It was 16 days of silence before anyone came to check. It was a gag order on an autopsy in a city where autopsies are public record. It was a government that called a death a suicide before the forensics were completed, and then called it a murder 4 days later, and then accused someone else of doing it, all in the space of a week, and hoped the noise would be sufficient to obscure the sequence. The documents survived, the testimony survived, the broadcasts, and the commission reports, and the court filings, and the congressional records, and the forensic re-examinations, and the deathbed confessions all survived. The books are in libraries. The commission reports are in archives. The inquest verdicts are on the official record. The sworn depositions are in legal files. The WikiLeaks emails are searchable. The broadcast of a 29-year-old journalist saying "I am frightened" on live television 2 days before she died is still on the internet. What did not always survive was the person who produced it. Of all the things these 10 people left behind, the manuscript, the documents, the testimony, the footage, the complaints, the lawsuits, the recordings, the evidence of a system that was not doing what it claimed to be doing, none of it was enough to guarantee that they would still be here to see what came of it. Some of them are alive, some of them are not. Some of them we simply do not know about with any certainty, because their cases remain in that category of officially unknown, where the absence of a final answer is itself a kind of answer, if you know how to read it. The light is still on in a house that someone left in a hurry. The glasses are on the table. The river is running. The file is open and the search is ongoing, and the probe has been announced, and the coroner's verdict and the police verdict are both still on the record, and neither has been resolved, and the laptop has never been returned, and the footage has never surfaced, and the body has never been found. 10 names, delivered the way the record delivers them, flat, without inflection, without resolution, without the closure that the narrative form usually provides at the end of something that has asked this much of an audience's attention and patience and willingness to sit with things that do not resolve. William Morgan, Frank Olsen, Gareth Williams, Alberto Nisman, Serena Shim, Ross Alderson, Val Broxmeyer, Chen Guangcheng, Roland Carnaby, William McCassland. 10 people who knew something they were not supposed to know, or who said something they were not supposed to say, or who tried to use a system that turned out to have different rules than the ones written on the door. 10 people for whom the officially unknown is not a temporary condition pending further investigation, but a permanent feature of a record that has decided, in its institutional wisdom, that some questions are better left unanswered. If you made it this far, subscribe. There are more cases where these came from, and some of them are worse. The map is on the table. The door is still locked. The light is still on. And somewhere out there, in a filing system, or a sealed autopsy, or a laptop that was taken from a crime scene and never returned, or a beach resort hotel in Australia, or a high desert mountain range east of Albuquerque, the answers exist. They are just not saying.